What if Naruto Uzumaki was actually the reincarnation of one of the most absolutely broken characters in all of anime, Baraggan Sainbern, the God King of Huko Mundo from Bleach? Now guys, let me tell you why this concept is absolutely insane. Baraggan isn't just any espada. This dude literally commands time and aging itself. We're talking about a being who can age anything he touches into dust, slow down time around himself, and has a resurrection that makes him the literal embodiment of death and decay. His Respira technique is so broken, it can age energy attacks out of existence. This is a character who ruled over an entire dimension for eons and only fell because Aizen used his own power against him in the most galaxy-brain betrayal move ever. So we thought, what if we took this cosmic-level authority and wisdom, these reality-breaking time manipulation abilities, and dropped them into the mind of the most determined, never-give-up ninja in the Hidden Leaf Village. Picture Naruto slowly awakening memories of absolute godhood while trying to stay true to his dream of becoming Hokage and protecting his friends. The internal conflict alone would be epic. You've got the boy who just wants acknowledgement wrestling with the consciousness of someone who commanded armies across dimensions. This story follows Naruto as he gradually unlocks Baraggan's memories and powers, from accidentally aging his academy jutsu to eventually developing God King mode and facing off against pain with the tactical knowledge of someone who's ruled for millennia. By the end, he becomes something entirely new, a leader who wields the authority of a god but chooses to serve rather than rule, creating techniques that can extend lifespans and building a world where people choose cooperation over conflict. If this concept sounds as mind-blowing to you as it does to me, absolutely smash that like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell because trust me, you do not want to miss content like this. Alright, let's dive into this masterpiece. If you're enjoying the stories here on YouTube, I share even more over on Patreon, including the kind of lemony content I can't post here. I upload every single day. The spicy tier unlocks the full library with hundreds of stories, plus daily uploads. And premium lets you send in your own lemon requests. So if you'd like to see the unfiltered side of my work and help keep the channel going, check out the Patreon. Link is in the description. The first dream came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks before graduation. Naruto jolted awake in his cramped apartment, cold sweat beading on his forehead despite the spring warmth. The dream had been vivid, more real than any nightmare he'd ever experienced. He could still taste the dry, metallic air of an endless desert, still feel the weight of something magnificent and terrible upon his brow. In the dream, he had been sitting on a throne carved from bone-white stone, looking down upon an army of hollow-eyed creatures that bowed before him with religious devotion. "Just a weird dream," he muttered, running fingers through his spiky blonde hair. But even as he said it, something deep in his chest, separate from the familiar warmth of the Nine-Tails chakra, stirred with what felt almost like nostalgia. The academy the next day offered no respite. Iruka was drilling them on transformation jutsu, and Naruto found himself struggling with an inexplicable irritation that had nothing to do with his usual academic frustrations. Every time one of his classmates failed a technique, something inside him whispered that such incompetence deserved punishment. Not the mild disappointment he usually felt, but something darker, more final. "Naruto, you're up," Iruka called, snapping him from his troubling thoughts. He stood, forming the familiar hand seals for the transformation jutsu. But as the chakra flowed through him, something else flowed with it, something ancient and patient that had been waiting just beneath the surface. The transformation that emerged wasn't quite right. His reflection in the window showed his usual appearance, but there was something in his eyes, a depth that spoke of eons rather than 12 years. "Good work, Naruto," Iruka said, though his brow furrowed slightly. "Your chakra control has improved significantly." Naruto blinked, and whatever had been looking out through his eyes receded. The compliment should have filled him with his usual explosive joy, but instead, he felt only a quiet satisfaction that seemed foreign to his nature. The dreams continued, growing more vivid with each passing night. He saw himself, or someone who wore his face but carried himself like a king, standing atop a fortress that scraped the pale sky. He commanded legions of warriors whose faces were hidden behind bone-white masks, and they obeyed not out of loyalty, but out of terror so profound it had crystallized into worship. In these dreams, he was called by a name that made the very air tremble, Baraggan Sainbern, God King of Huko Mundo. The name felt right on his tongue in ways that Naruto Uzumaki never had. But it was during a sparring session with Sasuke that things truly began to change. The Uchiha had been particularly arrogant that day, his dark eyes looking down on their classmates with the kind of casual disdain that would have normally made Naruto's blood boil with righteous anger. Instead, Naruto found himself studying Sasuke with clinical detachment, seeing not a rival but a subject who had forgotten his place. "You think you're so much better than everyone else," Naruto found himself saying, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made several nearby students step back instinctively. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. "I don't think it, Dobi, I know it." The response triggered something primal in Naruto's chest. For just a moment, the classroom seemed to age around him, the wooden desks growing brittle, the paint on the walls fading as if decades had passed in seconds. The sensation lasted only a heartbeat, but it left Naruto shaking and confused. Sasuke, for his part, had gone very still, his Sharingan flickering to life involuntarily as some instinct warned him of mortal danger. "Naruto," Iruka's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The teacher was staring at them both with concern and something that might have been fear. "Perhaps you should take a break." As Naruto left the classroom, he caught sight of his reflection in the hallway window. For just an instant, he could have sworn he saw a different face looking back, ancient and terrible, with eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall, and a crown that cast shadows deeper than night. The graduation exam arrived with spring's first real warmth, and Naruto found himself more nervous than he had ever been. Not because he feared failure, though that remained a genuine concern, but because something inside him was growing stronger, more insistent. The voice that whispered of his royal heritage, of power beyond mortal comprehension, of the right to rule through strength alone. "Shadow clone jutsu," he called out, forming the seals with practiced precision. But as the chakra shaped itself, that other presence stirred again, and the clones that emerged were subtly wrong. They moved with his energy and determination, but their faces carried traces of something older, more calculating. More concerningly, they seemed to flicker slightly, as if time itself was having trouble maintaining their existence. Iruka and Mizuki exchanged glances that Naruto caught despite their attempts at discretion. "Interesting variation," Mizuki said smoothly. "Your clones seem more sophisticated than usual." The word sophisticated resonated strangely, triggering a flash of memory, or was it a dream, of commanding servants who moved with perfect coordination, extensions of his will rather than independent beings. The thought should have disturbed him. Instead, it felt natural. "Congratulations, Naruto," Iruka said, holding out a Leaf Village headband. "You pass." The metal felt cool against his forehead as he tied it on, but there was something else, a phantom weight, as if another crown were settling into place alongside the simple ninja band. For just a moment, Naruto felt the overwhelming urge to declare that such a modest symbol was beneath his station, that he deserved something grander, more befitting his true nature. He bit down on the thought hard enough to taste blood. The apartment felt different that night, smaller somehow, as if his presence had grown to fill more space than his physical form should occupy. Naruto sat on his bed, staring at his new headband and wrestling with the growing certainty that he was becoming someone or something else. Deep within his mindscape, where he had never consciously ventured, two powers circled each other warily. The Nine Tails, ancient and terrible in its own right, found itself facing something that predated even its own considerable existence. The fox's usual rage was tempered by an unfamiliar emotion: respect. "You are not human," Kurama's voice echoed through the mental space, heavy with certainty. "What manner of being wears this boy's face?" The response came not in words but in images. A throne room vast beyond mortal comprehension, armies of the dead marching in perfect formation, and the slow, inexorable decay that claimed all things in time. The fox recoiled, its tails lashing in agitation. "Impossible, you died. I felt your spiritual pressure fade from existence." "Death is merely another kingdom to rule," came the reply, spoken in Naruto's voice but carrying the weight of eons. "And I am, always, a king." Team assignments were announced the following week, and Naruto found himself grouped with Sasuke Uchiha and Sakura Haruno under the supervision of Kakashi Hatake. The irony wasn't lost on him, placed on a team with the boy he had been conditioned to see as his rival and the girl who openly despised him. In his previous mindset, he might have seen it as another obstacle to overcome through determination and hard work. Now he found himself analyzing the political implications. Sasuke represented the remnants of a once powerful clan, his loyalty uncertain and his potential for betrayal high. Sakura was a civilian-born ninja whose skills were underdeveloped but whose strategic value lay in her intelligence and potential for growth. And Kakashi. When the silver-haired Jounin finally appeared, 3 hours late, and offering the lamest excuse Naruto had ever heard, something in the older ninja's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. His visible eye lingered on Naruto for just a moment longer than necessary, and there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he was prepared for sudden violence. "My first impression of you three," Kakashi said slowly, his gaze moving between them, "is that you're interesting. We'll do introductions tomorrow, followed by a survival exercise. I should mention that the failure rate for this test is over 60%. "What kind of test?" Sakura asked, her voice tight with concern. Kakashi's visible eye crinkled in what might have been a smile. "The kind that reveals who you really are." The words hit Naruto like a physical blow. Who he really was had become the central question of his existence, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. That night, the dreams were more vivid than ever. He stood in his throne room, but now he could see beyond the immediate chamber to the vast kingdom that stretched in all directions. Las Notches his mind supplied, though he had never heard the name before. His kingdom, his domain, a realm where time moved at his command and death itself bowed to his authority. He woke to find his small apartment filled with an oppressive spiritual pressure that made the air itself feel heavy. The plants on his windowsill had withered overnight, their leaves brown and brittle as if they had aged years in hours. The survival test took place at Training Ground 3, and Naruto arrived to find his teammates already there, both looking nervous despite their attempts to appear confident. Kakashi was reading one of his perverted novels, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "The rules are simple," the Jounin explained without looking up from his book. "You have until noon to take these 2 bells from me. Anyone who fails to get a bell will be tied to a post and watch the others eat lunch." Naruto felt a familiar surge of determination, but it was tinged now with something darker. The idea of being denied, of being treated as lesser, triggered responses that went beyond mere frustration. The air around him seemed to shimmer slightly, and for just an instant, Kakashi's visible eye snapped to him with laser focus. "Begin," Kakashi called, and immediately Sasuke and Sakura disappeared into the surrounding forest. Naruto started to follow, then stopped. Something inside him was whispering that direct confrontation was the approach of a king, not a sneaking child. He turned back to face Kakashi, who was still reading his book but whose entire body language suggested coiled readiness. "You're not going to hide?" Kakashi asked, sounding genuinely curious. "Kings don't hide," Naruto replied, and immediately wondered where the words had come from. Kakashi's book snapped shut. "Kings?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither fully understood. Naruto could feel something building in his chest, a pressure that wanted to be released, to show this presumptuous Jounin exactly what kind of power he was dealing with. Instead, he formed the hand seals for Shadow Clone Jutsu. But these clones were different from any he had created before. They moved with perfect coordination, their faces bearing expressions of cold calculation that had never belonged to Naruto Uzumaki. More disturbing still, they seemed to flicker in and out of focus, as if reality itself was having trouble maintaining their existence. Kakashi's visible eye widened slightly. Interesting technique. But numbers alone won't. He cut off mid-sentence as one of the clones brushed past a tree branch, and the wood immediately began to age and decay, crumbling to dust in seconds. "What the hell?" Kakashi breathed, his book forgotten as he pulled down his headband to reveal his Sharingan. Naruto felt a surge of satisfaction at the older ninja's shock, followed immediately by confusion at his own reaction. This wasn't how he normally felt when surprising people. Usually, he was excited, eager to share his accomplishment. Now he felt only cold pleasure at having demonstrated his superiority. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred in Konoha's training grounds. Naruto's clones moved with tactical precision that spoke of centuries of warfare experience, each one seeming to anticipate Kakashi's movements before he made them. And wherever they passed, the very environment began to show signs of accelerated aging. Kakashi found himself being pushed back, his usual lazy confidence replaced by genuine alarm. The boy fighting him bore Naruto's face and used Naruto's techniques, but everything else, the tactical awareness, the cold efficiency, the spiritual pressure that made his teeth ache, belonged to someone else entirely. "Naruto," Kakashi called out, dodging a clone that left footprints of withered grass in its wake. "What's happening to you?" The question pierced through the haze of battle fury that had been building in Naruto's mind. For just an instant, he saw the situation clearly, saw himself fighting with ruthless precision that belonged to someone else. saw the fear in Kakashi's visible eye, saw the way the training ground was being transformed into a wasteland by his mere presence. I don't know, he whispered, and his clones flickered out of existence as his concentration shattered. Kakashi appeared beside him in a swirl of leaves, one hand resting on Naruto's shoulder. The touch should have been comforting, but instead it made the foreign presence in Naruto's chest recoil in what might have been disgust. "We need to talk," Kakashi said quietly. "After the test." The rest of the exercise passed in a blur. Sasuke and Sakura eventually emerged from hiding, having missed the strange battle entirely, and the three genin eventually worked together to claim the bells through teamwork. Kakashi passed them all, citing their eventual cooperation, but his attention remained fixed on Naruto throughout his speech about the importance of working together. When Sasuke and Sakura left, chattering about their new team assignments, Kakashi gestured for Naruto to remain behind. "That wasn't the Shadow Clone Jutsu," the Jounin said without preamble. "I've seen that technique performed hundreds of times, and what you did, that was something else entirely." Naruto stared at his hands, watching the way the afternoon sunlight seemed to bend strangely around his fingers. "I don't understand what's happening to me, Kakashi-sensei. Sometimes I feel like I'm someone else, someone older, someone who was used to being obeyed," Kakashi finished quietly. The words hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Naruto nodded, not trusting his voice. Kakashi was quiet for a long moment, his visible eye studying Naruto with an intensity that made the boy want to squirm. "Have you told anyone else about this?" "Who would I tell?" Naruto asked bitterly. "Who would believe me?" "The Hokage might," Kakashi said carefully. "There are precedents for unusual manifestations of power in ninja history. Bloodline limits, cursed techniques, spiritual inheritances. Spiritual inheritances, powers or memories passed down through means other than genetics. Usually through," Kakashi paused, as if choosing his words carefully, "through souls that have experienced extreme trauma or possessed overwhelming spiritual energy." The explanation resonated with something deep in Naruto's consciousness. He found himself remembering, or dreaming, of a final battle, of falling before an enemy whose power had transcended mortal understanding, of dying with rage and regret burning in his chest like poison. "What if," Naruto said slowly, "what if the person I'm remembering being, what if they weren't human?" Kakashi's visible eye widened slightly. "What makes you ask that?" "The dreams, the memories. They're not of any place I've ever seen, not of any people I could ever know. And the things I remember being able to do." Naruto gestured vaguely at the patches of withered grass around them. "No human could do those things." "Show me," Kakashi said quietly. "What? Whatever it is you're remembering how to do, show me. I need to understand what we're dealing with." Naruto hesitated, some part of him recognizing that what Kakashi was asking for could change everything between them. But the older ninja's voice carried genuine concern rather than fear. And after weeks of wrestling with these changes alone, the prospect of sharing the burden was too tempting to resist. He closed his eyes and reached for that other presence in his chest, the one that whispered of kingdoms and crowns and power beyond mortal comprehension. This time, instead of fighting it, he let it flow through him. When he opened his eyes, Kakashi had taken several steps backward, his Sharingan spinning frantically as it tried to process what it was seeing. The air around Naruto had taken on a strange quality, as if time itself was moving differently in his immediate vicinity. More unsettling still, his face had changed subtly, his features sharper, his eyes holding depths that spoke of eons rather than years. "I was a king," Naruto said, and his voice carried harmonics that made the words feel like physical weight. "I ruled over a kingdom of the dead, commanded armies that stretched beyond the horizon, and time itself bent to my will. I was Baraggan Luxenbern, god king of Huko Mundo, and I died with the taste of betrayal on my tongue." The revelation hung between them like a challenge. Kakashi's hand had moved instinctively to his kunai pouch, though he didn't draw a weapon. "How long have you been remembering this?" he asked carefully. "Weeks, maybe months. It started with dreams, but they're getting more real, more detailed. And the power," Naruto gestured, and a nearby flower aged and withered in seconds. "It's getting stronger." Kakashi nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing through implications. "We need to report this to the Hokage immediately." "Will he?" Naruto's voice cracked slightly, returning to its normal register. "Will he think I'm dangerous? Will he lock me up or—" "The third Hokage is many things," Kakashi said firmly, "but he's not quick to condemn without understanding. Whatever's happening to you, we'll figure it out together." The promise should have been comforting, but as they walked back toward the village, Naruto could feel the other presence stirring restlessly in his chest. Kings, it whispered, did not subject themselves to the judgment of lesser beings. Kings ruled and all others obeyed, but Naruto Uzumaki wasn't ready to be a king, not yet. The Hokage's office felt different when you could sense the weight of mortality pressing down on everything in it. Naruto sat across from the third Hokage's desk, acutely aware of how the old man's spiritual energy flickered like a candle flame compared to the steady inferno that burned within his own chest. Kakashi had delivered his report with typical efficiency, outlining the events of the training exercise and Naruto's subsequent revelations. The Hokage had listened in silence, his weathered hands steepled before his face. "These memories you're experiencing," Sarutobi said finally, his voice gentle but probing, "do they feel like your own experiences or like stories you've been told?" "They feel," Naruto struggled to find the right words. "They feel more real than my actual memories sometimes, like they're more true than anything I've actually lived through." The Hokage nodded thoughtfully. "And this name, Baraggan Luxenbern, does it hold particular significance beyond being what you were called?" Something stirred in Naruto's chest, and when he spoke, his voice carried undertones that made the windows rattle slightly. "It was not merely what I was called. It was what I was. God King of Hukomundo, ruler of the Hollows, the aspect of death itself given form and will." Sarutobi's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what happened to this God King?" The question triggered a cascade of memory so vivid that Naruto gasped, his hands gripping the arms of his chair hard enough to leave finger-shaped impressions in the wood. He saw again the moment of his defeat, the impossible speed of his enemy, the way his absolute power had been turned against him, the humiliation of falling before one he had considered beneath his notice. "He betrayed me," Naruto whispered, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "Aizen Sasuke, he used my own arrogance against me, turned my greatest strength into weakness. I died raging against the injustice of it, against the impossibility that a mere captain could bring down a god." "Injustice," the Hokage repeated carefully. "Tell me, Naruto, when you remember being this God King, how do you feel about the people you ruled?" The question pierced through Naruto's angry remembrance like a blade. In his memories, his subjects were tools to be used, resources to be expended, creatures whose only value lay in their service to his will. The thought should have horrified him. It did horrify the part of him that was still purely Naruto Uzumaki. But another part of him, growing stronger each day, saw nothing wrong with such an attitude. "They were mine," he said simply. "Their lives, their deaths, their very existence, all of it belonged to me by right of strength." "And now," Sarutobi asked quietly, "how do you feel about the people of Konoha?" The question hung in the air like a test, and Naruto found himself genuinely uncertain of the answer. The people of Konoha had shunned him, feared him, treated him as a monster to be avoided. But they had also produced people like Iruka Senshi, who had shown him kindness when no one else would. Like Tsuchai and Ahiyame at Ikaraku, who had fed him when he was hungry and treated him like family. Naruto began, then stopped. The two aspects of his nature were pulling in different directions, creating a tension that made his head pound. "I want to protect them. But I also want them to acknowledge me, to recognize my worth. And sometimes I think the only way to get that recognition is to make them fear me the way they fear." He trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. "The way they fear the Nine Tails," Sarutobi completed gently. Naruto nodded miserably. "I know it's wrong. I know wanting people to fear you is wrong, but when I remember being Baraggan, it feels so right. So natural." The Hokage was quiet for a long moment, studying Naruto with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of nations. "Power without restraint leads to tyranny," he said finally. "But power without the will to use it leads to helplessness. The challenge, Naruto, is finding the balance between them. How do I do that when I don't even know which thoughts are mine anymore?" "By remembering what you truly want," Sarutobi said firmly. "Not what Baraggan wanted, not what the village expects, but what Naruto Uzumaki wants for himself and the people he cares about." The answer seemed too simple, but as Naruto considered it, he found a core of certainty buried beneath all the confusion and conflicted desires. He wanted to be acknowledged, yes, but not through fear. He wanted to protect people, not rule over them. He wanted to prove that he was more than the monster the village saw him as. "I want to be Hokage," he said, and for the first time in weeks, his voice was purely his own. "Not because I want power over people, but because I want to protect them." "All of them?" Sarutobi smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Then hold on to that desire, Naruto. Let it be your anchor when the other memories threaten to overwhelm you." But even as Naruto nodded his agreement, the presence in his chest stirred with what might have been amusement. Kings, it whispered, always began by claiming they served their people. It was only later that they realized their people existed to serve them. The first real test came 3 weeks later when Team 7 received their first C-rank mission. An escort mission to the Land of Waves, Kakashi explained as they walked toward the village gates. We're to protect a bridge builder named Tazuna until his work is complete. Naruto should have been excited, his first real mission, his first chance to prove himself as a ninja. Instead, he found himself studying their client with cold calculation that belonged to someone else. Tazuna was hiding something. His nervous energy and the way his eyes avoided direct contact suggested deception. In his memories, Baraggan had dealt with such deception swiftly and permanently. The thought should have disturbed him. Instead, it felt reasonable. They had been traveling for less than a day when they encountered the Demon Brothers of the Mist, 2 Chunin-level missing nin who attacked with poisoned claws and coordinated precision. Kakashi dealt with them efficiently, but not before they had revealed that their true target was Tazuna, and that the mission was far more dangerous than advertised. "You lied to us," Naruto said flatly, his voice carrying an undertone of authority that made Tazuna step backward instinctively. I had to," the bridge builder stammered. "If I'd told you the truth, you never would have taken the mission. My people are starving, dying under Gato's control. The bridge is their only hope." Under normal circumstances, Naruto would have been moved by the man's desperation, would have declared immediately that they would see the mission through regardless of the increased danger. Now he found himself weighing the political implications, considering whether Tazuna's deception merited punishment. "You endangered my team through your lies," he said, taking a step forward. The air around him shimmered slightly, and Tazuna's face went pale as some primal instinct warned him of mortal danger. "In my kingdom, such deception would merit Naruto." Kakashi's voice cut through his growing anger like a blade. "Stand down!" The command triggered 2 very different responses. Naruto Uzumaki, who respected his sense and trusted his judgment, wanted to comply immediately. But Baraggan Luisenbern, God King of Huko Mundo, had never bowed to anyone's authority, and the very idea of being commanded by a subordinate filled him with murderous rage. The conflicting impulses warred in his chest, and for a moment the air itself seemed to age around him, becoming thick and oppressive. Sasuke's hand moved instinctively to his kunai pouch, while Sakura pressed herself against a nearby tree, her face pale with instinctive terror. "Your kingdom?" Kakashi asked quietly, his visible eye fixed on Naruto with laser intensity. The question pierced through Naruto's rage, reminding him of where and when he was. This wasn't Huko Mundo, these weren't his subjects. And no matter what his memories told him, he was not a king. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the oppressive atmosphere around him dissipated like morning mist. "I don't know what came over me." But even as he said it, part of him knew exactly what had come over him. The same thing that would continue to come over him, growing stronger each day, until one day he might not be able to pull back from the brink. They continued toward the Land of Waves, but the dynamic of the team had changed. Sasuke watched him with wary calculation, clearly recognizing that whatever was happening to Naruto made him potentially dangerous. Sakura kept her distance, though whether from fear or disgust he couldn't tell. And Kakashi watched him with the focused attention of someone trying to decide whether his student was an asset or a threat. The boat ride across the mist-shrouded waters should have been peaceful, but Naruto found himself remembering other journeys across impossible distances, leading armies of the dead toward battlefields where entire civilizations would rise or fall. The memories were so vivid that he could almost hear the sound of bone against bone as his soldiers marched, could almost taste the ash-dry air of his kingdom. When the mist began to thicken around them, he knew they were being hunted long before their enemies revealed themselves. Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the hidden mist, emerged from the fog like a nightmare-given form. His massive sword gleamed with fresh blood, and his presence filled the air with killing intent so thick it was almost tangible. "Well, well," the missing nin said, his voice carrying across the water like the toll of a funeral bell. "Kakashi of the Sharingan, and his little genin students." Under normal circumstances, Naruto would have reacted with his usual bravado, would have declared loudly that he would protect everyone and defeat the enemy. Now he found himself studying Zabuza with the cold calculation of a predator evaluating potential prey. The missing nin was strong, stronger than anyone Naruto had faced before. But strength meant nothing without wisdom, and wisdom came only through experience. Zabuza had perhaps 20 years of combat experience. Baraggan had commanded armies for millennia. When Zabuza's first attack came, Naruto moved without conscious thought, his body flowing into defensive positions that belonged to sword forms older than human civilization. He intercepted a strike that should have taken his head off, his kunai meeting Zabuza's massive blade with a sound like thunder. The impact should have shattered every bone in his arm. Instead, Naruto found himself standing firm, his feet planted like tree roots, meeting the missing nin's shocked gaze with eyes that held depths no 12-year-old should possess. Impossible, Zabuza breathed. No genin could, his words cut off as he noticed the strange shimmer in the air around Naruto, the way the mist itself seemed to age and dissipate in his immediate vicinity. More disturbing still, the wooden handle of his own sword was beginning to show signs of decay where Naruto's kunai had made contact. "What the hell are you?" the missing nin demanded, leaping backward. Naruto straightened slowly, his movements carrying a regal grace that belonged to someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the very air vibrate. "I am the king of all things that decay," he said, and meant it. "The sovereign of entropy, the lord of ending, your blade may cut flesh, but I command time itself." The words should have sounded ridiculous coming from a 12-year-old boy. Instead, they carried such absolute conviction that even Zabuza found himself taking another step backward. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Hidden Mist had ever recorded. Naruto moved with fluid precision, his every technique enhanced by power that aged whatever it touched. His shadow clones flickered in and out of existence like temporal anomalies, each one carrying fragments of knowledge accumulated over eons of warfare. But it was when Haku appeared, when the boy in the mask sought to protect his master with ice mirrors that reflected like crystal prisons, that Naruto's true nature revealed itself. "You would cage a king?" he asked, his voice carrying such contempt that the very air around him began to shimmer with heat. "You would dare to confine one who has ruled since before your ancestors drew breath." He reached out with one hand, fingers spread, and simply exhaled. The breath that escaped his lips carried with it the weight of centuries, the slow dissolution that claimed all things in time. Where it touched Haku's ice mirrors, they didn't shatter, they aged, becoming brittle and gray and ancient, crumbling to dust that scattered on winds that tasted of endings. Haku stumbled backward, his mask cracking as some instinct older than thought warned him that he was facing something beyond his ability to comprehend or combat. "Senbone," he whispered, launching a flurry of the thin needles with desperate precision. Naruto didn't bother to dodge. As the projectiles approached him, they simply stopped. Not caught, not deflected, but frozen in time itself, suspended in the air around him like insects trapped in amber. "Time," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather, "is the domain of kings, and I have been a king longer than your species has drawn breath." He gestured dismissively, and the senbone aged to rust and scattered on the wind. It was Sasuke's voice that brought him back to himself. "Naruto," his teammate shouted, and there was something in his tone, not fear but recognition. The Uchiha had seen darkness before, had lived with it, and he recognized what was happening to his teammate. "That's enough," the words cut through the haze of absolute power that had been building in Naruto's mind. He blinked, suddenly aware of where he was, what he was doing. The oppressive atmosphere around him dissipated, and he staggered slightly as the full weight of his actions hit him. He had been about to kill Haku, not in the heat of battle, not in self-defense, but simply because the boy had dared to oppose him. The realization filled him with horror that was purely his own. He began, then stopped, having no words for what had just happened. Haku was staring at him with wide eyes visible through the cracks in his mask. "What are you?" he whispered. "I don't know," Naruto replied honestly, and the admission hurt more than any physical wound. The rest of the battle passed in a blur of activity and revelation. Zabuza's eventual betrayal of Haku, the arrival of Gato's thugs, the bridge builder's courage in the face of overwhelming odds, all of it seemed to happen at a distance, as if Naruto were watching through glass. But it was the moment when Haku died protecting Zabuza, when the boy who had been his enemy sacrificed everything for someone who saw him only as a tool, that something shifted in Naruto's understanding of himself. Kings, he realized, inspired fear and obedience. But Haku had felt love, had been willing to die for it, and in doing so had achieved something that all of Baraggan's power and authority had never been able to create. "He really loved you," Naruto said to Zabuza's corpse, his voice small and purely his own. "And you threw that away." The words were meant for the dead missing nin, but they resonated in his own chest like a promise. Whatever power was growing within him, whatever memories of kingship and dominion were awakening, He would not let them cost him the chance to love and be loved in return. When they finally returned to Konoha, the bridge behind them renamed in honor of Naruto's courage, he felt changed in ways that went beyond the continuing evolution of his abilities. The presence in his chest was still there, still whispering of power and authority and the right to rule. But now there was something else as well, a determination to prove that strength and compassion were not mutually exclusive. "How do you feel?" Kakashi asked as they passed through the village gates. Naruto considered the question seriously. "Like I'm two people trying to become one," he said finally. "And I'm not sure which one is going to win." "Maybe," Kakashi suggested quietly, "the goal isn't for one to win, maybe it's for both to find a way to coexist." The idea was intriguing, but as they walked through the streets of Konoha, Naruto could feel the other presence stirring with what might have been disagreement. Kings, it whispered, did not coexist with their subjects. They ruled them. But Naruto Uzumaki had never wanted to be a king. He had wanted to be Hokage, and perhaps, if he was very careful and very strong, there might be a way to be both. The first arc of his transformation was complete, but Naruto could sense that greater challenges lay ahead. The power growing within him would only become stronger, the memories more vivid, the temptation to embrace his royal nature more seductive. But he had learned something important in the land of waves. Power without compassion was merely tyranny, and tyranny was a kingdom built on foundations of sand. He would find a way to be both the protector he wanted to be and the king his memories insisted he was. He would find a way to rule without becoming a tyrant, to command without destroying love. He would find a way or die trying. After all, he had been a king once before, and this time he would be a better one. The Chunin exams were announced on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with possibility and dread in equal measure. Naruto sat in the academy classroom, now repurposed for team meetings, listening to Kakashi explain the nature of the upcoming trials, but his attention kept drifting to the strange dreams that had been plaguing him for the past month. Since returning from the land of waves, the memories had become more frequent, more detailed. He could now recall entire conversations from his time as Baraggan, remember the faces of his subordinates, feel the weight of the crown that had once rested upon his brow. More disturbing still, he was beginning to remember his death, not just the moment of defeat, but the burning rage that had consumed him as he realized a mere Soul Reaper captain had brought down a god. The Chunin exams consist of 3 stages, Kakashi was saying, his visible eye moving between his 3 students. Each stage is designed to test different aspects of a ninja's capabilities: intelligence, survival skills, and combat ability. "Sounds easy enough," Naruto said, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt the other presence stirring in his chest. Easy, it whispered, for one who had commanded armies and crushed rebellions that spanned continents. Sasuke's dark eyes fixed on him with calculating intensity. "You've been different since Wave," he said bluntly. "Stronger, but also," he paused, searching for the right word, "colder." The observation was more accurate than Naruto cared to admit. The memories of kingship came with emotional distance, a kind of icy calculation that evaluated everything and everyone in terms of their utility. It was becoming harder to maintain his usual enthusiasm, harder to feel the simple joy that had once defined him. "I'm just focused," Naruto replied, but Sasuke's expression suggested he wasn't convinced. "The first exam takes place in 5 days, Kakashi continued, apparently choosing to ignore the undercurrent of tension between his students. "I'm recommending all 3 of you, but the decision to participate is ultimately yours." There had never really been a choice, of course. Naruto's path to becoming Hokage led through the Chunin exams, and besides, something deep in his consciousness was already analyzing the political implications of the gathered foreign ninja. Information, the voice of Baraggan whispered, was the foundation of all power. The written portion of the first exam took place in a classroom that seemed designed to inspire anxiety. Rows of desks filled with genin from every major hidden village, proctored by scarred Chunin, whose eyes promised swift and terrible retribution for any form of cheating. Naruto took his assigned seat and stared down at the test paper with growing unease. The questions were far beyond anything they had covered in the academy, complex problems of strategy, logistics, and intelligence analysis that would have challenged most Chunin. Under normal circumstances, he would have panicked, perhaps tried to copy from a neighbor or given up entirely. But as he read through the questions, something else stirred in his mind, knowledge that belonged to someone who had ruled a kingdom for millennia, who had planned campaigns across dimensions and managed the logistics of armies that numbered in the millions. His hand moved almost without conscious direction, filling in answers with confidence that felt foreign yet natural. Battle formations for asymmetric warfare, supply chain management for extended sieges, intelligence networks and their vulnerabilities, all of it flowed from his pen as if he were recounting personal experience, which he realized with growing unease he was. "Time," Ibiki Morino barked, and Naruto set down his pen with the strange certainty that he had just passed an exam covering material he had never studied. The second phase took place in the Forest of Death, a training ground so dangerous that teams regularly died during routine exercises. As Naruto stood before the chain-link fence, staring into the twisted shadows between ancient trees, he felt something that might have been homesickness. The forest reminded him of the Menno's forest in Mundo, the same oppressive atmosphere, the same sense of predators lurking just beyond perception. For just a moment, he could almost hear the sound of his Fraxion moving through similar terrain, could almost feel the weight of his crown as he surveyed his domain from the throne room of Las Notches. "Earth Scroll," Anko announced, handing the sealed document to Sasuke. "You have 5 days to reach the tower at the center of the forest with both Earth and Heaven scrolls in your possession." The words faded into background noise as Naruto's enhanced senses picked up the spiritual pressures of the other teams. Most were unremarkable, the flickering flames of young ninja with limited experience. But there were exceptions, points of darkness that spoke of power beyond the norm. One in particular made his breath catch in his throat. A spiritual pressure that felt familiar, that carried echoes of something vast and hungry and utterly without mercy. His eyes swept the assembled teams until he found the source. A pale man with snake-like eyes who watched the proceedings with the kind of patient interest that belonged to apex predators. Orochimaru. The name surfaced from somewhere in his awakening memories, though he couldn't place where he might have encountered it before. But the spiritual pressure was unmistakable. This was someone who had transcended normal human limitations, who had touched powers that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Someone, in other words, like himself. "Gates open in 30 seconds, Anko called out. Naruto turned to his teammates, intending to suggest a strategy, but the words died in his throat as he saw the way they were looking at him. Sasuke's expression was wary, calculating, as if he were trying to decide whether Naruto was still the same person he had trained with. Sakura seemed frightened, though whether of him or the upcoming trial, he couldn't tell. "Naruto," Sasuke said quietly, "whatever's been happening to you lately, try to keep it under control in there." The warning might have stung, once upon a time. Now it simply felt like good tactical advice from a subordinate who understood the stakes. The forest was a maze of death that seemed designed to break teams through attrition and despair. Within the first hour, they had encountered 3 different groups of hostile wildlife, navigated 2 trapped clearings, and identified at least 6 potential ambush sites. Naruto moved through it all with fluid grace, his enhanced senses picking up threats before they materialized, his tactical knowledge allowing him to guide his team along paths that minimized exposure. It should have felt like teamwork. Instead, it felt like a general directing troops across a battlefield he had studied for centuries. "How do you know where to go?" Sakura asked during their 3rd hour of travel, when Naruto had successfully guided them around what appeared to be empty ground, but which his instincts insisted was an elaborate trap. "Experience," he replied automatically, then paused as he realized the implications of his own words. What experience could a 12-year-old boy possibly have with navigating hostile territory? But the memories were there, clear as daylight, countless campaigns across the endless deserts of Mundo, battles fought in terrain far more treacherous than any earthly forest. He could recall specific engagements, remember the faces of enemies who had tried and failed to outmaneuver his forces. It was during their 4th hour in the forest that they encountered the team from the hidden grass village. The attack came without warning, a coordinated assault designed to incapacitate rather than kill, which suggested the attackers wanted their scroll intact. Sasuke and Sakura reacted with creditable speed, but they were clearly outmatched by opponents with superior experience and coordination. Naruto, however, had been expecting something like this since they entered the forest. He moved with liquid precision, his body flowing into combat forms that had been perfected over millennia of warfare. The first attacker, a Kunoichi with wind-based jutsu, found her techniques dissipating as they approached him, her chakra-enhanced air currents aging into stillness before they could strike. The second attacker tried to close to melee range, only to stumble backward as the very ground beneath Naruto's feet began to show signs of advanced decay. Wood became brittle, stone cracked and crumbled, and the air itself took on the thick, oppressive quality of something ancient and tired. "What the hell are you?" the third attacker demanded, his voice tight with fear. Naruto straightened slowly, and for just a moment his teammates could see something else looking out through his eyes, something old and terrible and utterly without mercy. "I am the end of all things," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that made the words feel like physical weight. "I am the slow decay that claims kingdoms, the entropy that reduces mountains to dust." "You would steal from a king?" The attackers were already backing away, their survival instincts screaming warnings that their rational minds couldn't process. But it was too late for retreat. Naruto raised one hand, fingers spread, and simply exhaled. The breath that escaped his lips carried with it the weight of eons, the patient dissolution that claimed all things in time. Where it touched, the very forest began to age, leaves browning and falling, bark becoming brittle, the rich scent of growing things replaced by the dry smell of dust and endings. The grass ninja didn't even try to fight. They fled, abandoning their scroll and whatever mission had brought them to the forest in favor of simple survival. When the dust settled, literally, as several nearby trees crumbled to ash, Naruto found himself standing in a circle of devastation that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. His teammates were staring at him with expressions that mixed awe and terror in equal measure. "Naruto," Sasuke said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "what's happening to you?" The question pierced through the haze of absolute authority that had been building in Naruto's mind. He looked around at the destruction he had wrought, at the fear in his friend's eyes, and felt something that might have been shame. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice returning to its normal register. "It's like there's someone else in my head, someone who remembers being more than human." "More than human how?" Sakura asked, though her body language suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Naruto was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something that existed beyond normal experience. "Like a king," he said finally, "but not a king of people, a king of concepts. Of time and death and the slow ending of all things." The admission hung between them like a challenge. Sasuke's hand had moved instinctively to his kunai pouch, though Naruto doubted his teammate was even aware of the gesture. "Is it dangerous?" Sasuke asked bluntly. "This, other presence?" "I think it could be," Naruto replied honestly. "It wants things I don't want, values things I don't value. But it's also," he paused, searching for the right words, "it's also teaching me things, showing me how to be stronger, how to understand strategy and combat in ways I never could before." "At what cost?" Sakura whispered. The question cut to the heart of his fears. What was the cost of accepting this power, of embracing the memories and knowledge that came with it? Would he still be Naruto Uzumaki when the transformation was complete, or would he become something else entirely? Before he could answer, a new presence made itself known in the forest around them. This one was different from the grass ninja, older, more controlled, and radiating a spiritual pressure that made Naruto's enhanced senses scream warnings. Orochimaru emerged from the shadows between the trees like a nightmare given form. His pale skin seemed to gleam in the filtered sunlight, and his snake-like eyes fixed on Naruto with predatory interest. "How fascinating," the Sannin said, his voice carrying sibilant undertones that made the words feel like caresses. "I sensed an unusual spiritual pressure and came to investigate, but this exceeds my wildest expectations." Sasuke moved instinctively to place himself between Orochimaru and his teammates, his Sharingan spinning to life. "Stay back," he warned, though his voice carried more bravado than confidence. Orochimaru's gaze never left Naruto. "You're not entirely human, are you, boy? There's something else sharing that body of yours, something old and powerful and deliciously corrupted." The words triggered something primal in Naruto's chest. The presence that had been growing stronger each day suddenly surged forward, bringing with it memories of other beings who had spoken to him with such casual disrespect. When Naruto straightened, his posture carried the regal bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. His chakra flared outward, but it was wrong somehow, too dense, too oppressive, carrying undertones of spiritual pressure that made the very air feel heavy. "You dare," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to something far older than 12 years. "You dare address a king with such insolence." Orochimaru's eyes widened with genuine surprise, followed immediately by hungry interest. "A king, you say? How delightful. Tell me, young king, what realm do you rule?" The question triggered a cascade of memory so vivid that Naruto gasped. He could see it all again. The bone-white towers of Las Notches stretching toward a starless sky, the endless armies of hollows that marched at his command, the throne room where he had held court over concepts themselves. "I ruled over death itself," he replied, and meant it. I was Baraggan Luisenbairn, God King of Mundo, sovereign of entropy and decay. Time bent to my will and armies spanning dimensions trembled at my approach. Was, Orochimaru repeated, seizing on the past tense with typical precision. But no longer. The reminder of his defeat sent fresh rage coursing through Naruto's spiritual pressure. Around him, the forest began to age rapidly, bark cracking, leaves withering, the very air taking on the dry taste of endings. I was betrayed, he snarled, and his teammates stumbled backward as killing intent rolled off him in waves. Aizen Sasuke, a mere captain who dared to challenge a god. He used my own power against me, turned my greatest strength into weakness. Aizen, Orochimaru repeated thoughtfully. I'm not familiar with that name, but the principle is sound. Power without wisdom is simply destruction waiting for direction. The comment cut deeper than any physical wound could have. It echoed thoughts that had been growing in Naruto's mind since the Land of Waves, doubts about whether raw power could ever be enough without the wisdom to use it properly. You speak as if you understand, Naruto said, his voice dropping to dangerous quiet. Orochimaru smiled, the expression transforming his pale features into something reptilian. I understand the frustration of being contained in flesh too weak to hold your true potential. Tell me, young king, would you like to be free of such limitations? The offer hung in the air like temptation given form. Part of Naruto, the part that remembered being a god, wanted to accept immediately, to embrace whatever transformation Orochimaru was offering. But another part, the part that was still purely Naruto Uzumaki, recoiled from the hungry interest in the Sannin's eyes. What are you offering? He asked carefully. Power, Orochimaru replied simply. The means to reclaim what was taken from you, to rise above the petty limitations of mortal flesh. All you need do is accept my gift. He moved with snake-like speed, his hand extending toward Naruto's neck, but before he could make contact, something unexpected happened. Sasuke Uchiha, driven by instincts he didn't fully understand, threw himself between them. Don't, he said, his Sharingan spinning frantically as it tried to track Orochimaru's movements. Whatever you're offering, it's not worth the price you'll demand. The intervention broke through the haze of temptation that had been building in Naruto's mind. He looked at his teammate, someone who had chosen to protect him despite the fear he had been radiating, and felt something shift in his understanding of himself. Kings, he realized, inspired loyalty through fear and necessity. But Sasuke's protection came from something else entirely, from friendship, from the bonds they had forged as teammates. It was freely given, and that made it infinitely more valuable than any loyalty his royal presence could command. No, Naruto said, and his voice was purely his own. I don't want power that comes at the cost of who I am. Orochimaru's expression shifted from hungry interest to cold calculation. How disappointing, but perhaps in time you'll reconsider. He moved again, this time targeting Sasuke with a speed that bordered on teleportation. His bite was precise, clinical, and the curse mark that bloomed on Sasuke's neck carried with it spiritual pressure that made the air itself feel corrupted. A parting gift, Orochimaru said as Sasuke collapsed, writhing in pain. For the young Uchiha who showed such touching loyalty, we'll see how long that lasts when the power I've given him begins to sing. Then he was gone, vanishing back into the forest shadows as if he had never been there at all. Naruto knelt beside his fallen teammate, his hands hovering uncertainly over the curse mark that was spreading across Sasuke's skin like infection. The spiritual pressure radiating from it was similar to what he felt from his own awakening memories, ancient, powerful, and fundamentally corrupting. Sasuke, he whispered, and for the first time since his memories began awakening, his voice carried nothing but genuine concern. The Uchiha's eyes opened slowly, and Naruto could see something different in them, a hunger that hadn't been there before, a darkness that seemed to echo the shadows in his own soul. I'm fine, Sasuke said, though his voice was strained. But that mark, I can feel it, it wants something. Power, Naruto said quietly, it wants you to embrace power without considering the cost. Like you've been doing, Sasuke asked, though there was no accusation in his tone. The question hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Naruto had been embracing his awakening memories, accepting the knowledge and abilities they brought without fully considering what else he might be accepting along with them. Yeah, he admitted. Like I've been doing. They made it to the tower in the forest center 2 days later, their stolen heaven scroll joining their original earth scroll to qualify them for the next phase. But the victory felt hollow in light of what had happened with Orochimaru. Sasuke's curse mark had remained largely dormant during their remaining time in the forest, but Naruto could sense it, a dark presence that whispered of easy power and simple solutions. It reminded him uncomfortably of the voice in his own head, the one that promised him the strength to reclaim his rightful place as king of all things. The preliminary matches were held in an underground arena that seemed designed to showcase individual combat ability. Naruto found himself paired against Kiba Inuzuka, a matchup that should have been relatively straightforward. But as he stood across from his opponent in the arena's center, surrounded by the watching eyes of Chunin hopefuls and Jounin instructors, something began to build in his chest. The weight of observation, the pressure of performance, the need to prove himself worthy, all of it combined to trigger memories of other arenas, other audiences who had watched him demonstrate his power. In those memories, failure had not been an option. Weakness had been met with swift and terrible punishment. And those who dared to challenge a god king had learned the price of such presumption through personal experience. "Ready?" Hayate Geiko asked, though his expression suggested he was already regretting whatever was about to happen. Naruto nodded, but when he moved it was with fluid precision that belonged to someone who had commanded armies. His killing intent rolled outward in waves, and several of the watching genin stumbled backward as primal instincts screamed warnings of mortal danger. Kiba's confident grin faltered as he found himself facing not the cheerful loudmouth he had expected, but something that radiated authority and menace in equal measure. "What the hell?" he whispered, his hand moving instinctively to Akamaru's fur for comfort. "You challenge a king?" Naruto asked, his voice carrying harmonics that made the arena's stone walls vibrate. "You dare stand as equal to one who has ruled since before your bloodline drew breath." The spiritual pressure he was radiating began to affect the arena itself. Stone cracked under the weight of his presence, and the air became thick and oppressive. More disturbing still, several of the torches around the arena's perimeter began to gutter and fail, their flames aging into smoke and ash. In the observation balcony, several Jounin exchanged worried glances. Kakashi's visible eye was fixed on his student with laser intensity, while Might Guy shifted into a ready stance despite being nowhere near the combat zone. "This isn't normal chakra," Korinahi Yuhi murmured to Asuma Sarutobi. "It feels old, ancient even." Below them, Kiba was struggling to remain upright under the weight of Naruto's killing intent. Akamaru had begun whimpering, his animal instincts responding to something that his human partner couldn't fully comprehend. I yield," Kiba stammered, his usual bravado completely absent. "Yield," Naruto repeated, and there was something terrifying in his tone. "You believe yielding will save you from the consequences of your presumption." He took a step forward, and where his foot touched the arena floor, the stone began to age and crack. Another step, and the crack spread outward like a spider web of entropy. "In my kingdom," he continued conversationally, "those who challenged my authority learned the price of such arrogance through personal experience. Shall I demonstrate that lesson?" "Naruto," Kakashi's voice cut through the building tension like a blade. "Stand down, the match is over." The command should have been simple to obey. But kings, the voice in Naruto's head whispered, did not take orders from subordinates. Kings commanded and all others obeyed. For a moment that stretched like eternity, two natures warred in Naruto's chest. The memories of absolute authority demanded that he finish what had begun, that he demonstrate the price of challenging a god king. But the part of him that was still Naruto Uzumaki recoiled from the idea of harming someone who had already surrendered. It was the sight of genuine terror in Kiba's eyes that finally broke through the haze of royal prerogative. The Inuzuka boy was afraid, not just of losing, but of dying, of being destroyed by something beyond his ability to understand or combat. And Naruto realized that he didn't want to be the source of that kind of terror. The oppressive spiritual pressure dissipated like morning mist, leaving behind only a 12-year-old boy who looked as confused and frightened as his opponent. "I'm sorry," Naruto whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know what came over me." But even as he said it, he knew exactly what had come over him. The same thing that would continue to come over him, growing stronger each day, until one day he might not be able to pull back from the brink. The month between the preliminaries and the final exam passed in a blur of intense training and mounting anxiety. Naruto found himself working with Jiraiya, one of the legendary Sannin, though the Toad Sage's reaction to his student was far from what either had expected. "Your chakra," Jiraiya said during their first training session, his usually jovial expression replaced by something approaching concern. "It's familiar, but I can't place where I might have encountered something similar." They were working on summoning technique in a secluded training ground, far from the village where Naruto's increasingly unstable spiritual pressure couldn't affect civilian populations. But even here, the effects of his presence were becoming apparent. Plants withering without cause, stone developing stress fractures, the air itself taking on the oppressive quality of something ancient and tired. Familiar how? Naruto asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Jiraiya was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Naruto with an intensity that made the boy want to fidget. Like something I encountered during my travels, he said finally. Something that shouldn't exist in our world. The comment triggered a flash of memory, not from Baraggan's past, but from more recent experiences. The way Orochimaru had looked at him in the Forest of Death, the hungry interest in the Sannin's eyes, the sense that he was recognizing something rather than discovering it. What kind of something? Naruto pressed. I'm not sure I should tell you, Jiraiya replied carefully. Some knowledge is dangerous to possess, especially for someone your age. But Naruto could see the concern in his mentor's eyes, could sense the older man's genuine worry about what his student was becoming. And that concern, more than any direct explanation, told him everything he needed to know. Whatever was happening to him, it was something that even one of the legendary Sannin found troubling. The final exam took place in an arena packed with spectators from across the ninja world. Dignitaries, merchants, potential clients, all gathered to witness the next generation of ninja demonstrate their capabilities. It should have been the culmination of everything Naruto had worked toward since joining the academy. Instead, it felt like a stage for powers beyond normal human comprehension. His match against Neji Hyuga was scheduled for the afternoon, but Naruto found himself studying his opponent from the beginning of the tournament. The Hyuga prodigy moved with fluid precision, his Byakugan giving him advantages that went far beyond simple visual enhancement. But more than that, he carried himself with the kind of absolute confidence that came from believing in his own superiority. It reminded Naruto uncomfortably of himself, or rather, of the memories that were becoming increasingly difficult to separate from his own experiences. When their match was finally called, Naruto stepped into the arena's center feeling the weight of thousands of watching eyes. The crowd's attention should have energized him, should have triggered his usual desire to show off and prove himself worthy of acknowledgement. Instead, it felt like a royal court gathering to witness their king's demonstration of power. So, Neji said, his pale eyes fixed on Naruto with calculating intensity, the dead last finally gets his moment. I almost feel sorry for you. Sorry, Naruto repeated, his voice carrying undertones that made several of the watching Chunin shift uncomfortably. You feel sorry for me? Your fate was sealed the moment you were matched against a prodigy of the Hyuga clan, Neji continued, apparently oblivious to the way the air around Naruto was beginning to shimmer with heat. Some things cannot be changed through effort alone. The word fate triggered something primal in Naruto's consciousness. Memories flooded through him of another being who had spoken of inevitability, of destiny, of powers beyond mortal ability to resist. Aizen Sasuke, who had orchestrated Baraggan's downfall with the calm certainty of someone who believed himself to be beyond the reach of consequence. Fate, Naruto said, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to something far older than 12 years. You speak of fate as if it were absolute, as if it could command even kings. When he straightened, his posture carried the regal bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. His spiritual pressure began to build, and the arena's stone floor started showing signs of stress fractures. I was told my fate was sealed once before, he continued, his eyes fixed on Neji with laser intensity. Aizen Sasuke, a mere captain who dared to challenge a god king, who spoke of destiny and inevitability as if they were weapons he could wield. In the observation booth, several of the watching Jounin exchanged worried glances. The spiritual pressure radiating from Naruto was unlike anything they had encountered before. Not just powerful, but old, carrying undertones that spoke of experiences far beyond normal human comprehension. And where is this Aizen now? Neji asked, though his confident tone had developed a slight tremor. Dead, Naruto replied with cold satisfaction. As are all who presume to lecture kings on the nature of inevitability. The claim wasn't entirely true in his memories. Aizen had transcended death itself, had become something beyond normal categories of existence. But the spiritual pressure that had marked his passing had carried with it the certain knowledge that his defeat had come at enormous cost to his enemies. Begin, Hayate called, though his voice carried none of its usual authority. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Chunin exams had ever witnessed. Neji moved with the fluid precision of the gentle fist style, his Byakugan tracking chakra points with surgical accuracy. But Naruto moved like something that had been fighting for millennia. Every technique was executed with perfect efficiency, every movement flowing naturally into the next, as if choreographed by centuries of combat experience. But more disturbing than his technical skill was the way his presence affected the arena itself, stone aging and cracking under his feet, the air becoming thick and oppressive, torches guttering and failing as if time itself was being accelerated in his vicinity. Impossible, Neji breathed as his strongest techniques failed to even scratch his opponent. Your chakra network, it's not human. I told you, Naruto replied conversationally as he deflected another gentle fist strike with casual ease. I am a king. And kings are not bound by the limitations that constrain lesser beings. His counterattack was devastating in its simplicity, a single palm strike that carried with it the weight of eons. Where it connected with Neji's chest, the Hyuga's clothing began to age and deteriorate, the fabric becoming brittle and gray as if decades had passed in seconds. Neji staggered backward, his pale eyes wide with shock and the first hints of genuine fear. What are you? I am Baraggan, Naruto replied, and his voice carried such absolute conviction that even the watching Hokage felt a chill of recognition. God King of Mundo, sovereign of entropy and decay. I have ruled since before your civilization drew breath, and I will rule long after your bloodline has crumbled to dust. The declaration should have sounded ridiculous coming from a 12-year-old boy. Instead, it carried such overwhelming spiritual pressure that several of the watching genin collapsed under the weight of it. But it was Neji's response that changed everything. If you're truly a king, the Hyuga said, his voice tight with pain and desperation, then why are you here? Why lower yourself to participate in tests designed for mere mortals? The question cut through Naruto's royal certainty like a blade. Why was he here? If he truly was the reincarnation of a god king, if he possessed power beyond mortal comprehension, then what was he doing in a ninja academy's graduation exercise? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Because despite the memories, despite the power, despite the ancient knowledge that whispered in his mind, he was still Naruto Uzumaki. Still a boy who wanted acknowledgement, who dreamed of becoming Hokage, who valued the bonds he had formed with his teammates above any throne. Because, he said quietly, his voice returning to its normal register, being a king means nothing if you have no one worth protecting. The admission broke the spell of absolute authority that had been building around him. His spiritual pressure dissipated, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and suddenly he was just a 12-year-old boy standing in an arena that showed signs of supernatural aging. Neji stared at him for a long moment, his Byakugan still active, still trying to process what his enhanced vision was telling him about his opponent's true nature. You're not going to kill me, he said, and it wasn't a question. No, Naruto replied. I'm going to prove that fate isn't absolute, that even someone born into the branch family can choose their own path. What followed was perhaps the strangest battle in Chunin exam history, not because of the techniques used, but because of what it represented. Naruto fighting not with the cold efficiency of a god king, but with the passionate determination of a boy who refused to accept that anyone's destiny was sealed at birth. When Neji finally fell, unconscious but unharmed, the arena erupted in applause. But Naruto barely heard it. His attention was fixed on something else entirely, a presence in the observation booth that radiated spiritual pressure similar to his own. Orochimaru, disguised as the fourth Kazekage, was watching him with hungry interest. And in that moment, Naruto realized that his transformation was far from complete. The memories of Baraggan were only the beginning of something larger, something that would challenge everything he thought he understood about power, responsibility, and the price of ambition. The Chunin exams had revealed his true nature to the world. Now he would have to decide what to do with that revelation. As he left the arena, his teammates falling into step beside him, Naruto could feel the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a crown he had never asked to wear. The boy who wanted to become Hokage and the God King who remembered ruling over death itself would have to find a way to coexist. Because the alternative, letting one nature completely consume the other, was a price he was not willing to pay. The sound of shattering glass echoed through Naruto's apartment at 3 in the morning, jolting him from dreams of bone-white towers and endless armies. But it wasn't an intruder that had broken his window, it was his own spiritual pressure, building unconsciously as the memories grew stronger each night. 6 weeks had passed since the Chunin exams, 6 weeks of increasingly vivid recollections that made his 12 years of human life feel like a brief interruption in an eternal reign. He could now remember entire conversations from his time as Baraggan, recall the faces and names of his subordinates, feel the weight of decisions that had shaped the fate of dimensions. More troubling still, he was beginning to understand the political landscape of his former kingdom. The delicate balance of power between his fraction, the constant threat of rebellion from lesser hollows, and the ultimate betrayal that had led to his downfall. It was knowledge that had no place in the mind of a Konoha genin, yet it felt more real than his ninja training. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Given the hour, it could only mean one thing: mission. Shikamaru Nafra stood in the hallway, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Behind him, Naruto could sense the spiritual pressures of other ninja, Choji, Neji, Kiba, and Lee. A retrieval team then, though for what target remained unclear. Troublesome, Shikamaru muttered, his dark eyes studying Naruto with calculating intensity. We need to talk. They gathered in the forest outside Konoha's walls, away from civilian populations that might be affected by whatever was about to be discussed. The assembled genin formed a loose circle, but Naruto noticed how they unconsciously maintained distance from him, close enough for conversation, far enough to run if necessary. Sasuke's gone, Shikamaru said without preamble. Left sometime during the night. We found this at the village gates. He held up a scratched forehead protector, the metal plate bearing a deep gouge that looked deliberate. A formal renunciation of his loyalty to Konoha then, not a kidnapping or coercion. The news should have hit Naruto like a physical blow. Sasuke was his teammate, his rival, someone he had sworn to protect and bring back no matter the cost. Under normal circumstances, he would have exploded into action immediately, demanding they pursue the Uchiha with everything they had. Instead, he found himself analyzing the political implications with cold calculation that belonged to someone else. He went willingly, Naruto said, his voice carrying undertones that made the other genin shift uncomfortably. This was planned, not impulsive. How can you be sure? Lee asked, his usual enthusiasm dampened by the gravity of the situation. Because I understand ambition, Naruto replied, and there was something in his tone that spoke of personal experience with betrayal and abandonment. He wants power more than he wants loyalty. The question is what he's willing to sacrifice to obtain it. Shikamaru's eyes narrowed slightly. You sound like you're talking from experience. The observation was more accurate than any of them realized. In his memories, Baraggan had witnessed countless subordinates choose personal advancement over loyalty, had seen the hunger for power corrupt even his most trusted followers. The pattern was as predictable as it was disappointing. We need to bring him back, Neji said, his pale eyes fixed on Naruto with calculating intensity. Before he does something he can't undo. Can't undo, Naruto repeated, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to something far older than 12 years. You speak as if choices can be unmade, as if consequences can be avoided through regret alone. The spiritual pressure radiating from him began to affect the forest around them, leaves withering on their branches, bark developing stress fractures, the very air becoming thick and oppressive. In my kingdom, he continued, his eyes distant with memory, those who chose betrayal faced the consequences of their decisions. There were no second chances, no opportunities for redemption. Loyalty was absolute or it was nothing. Your kingdom? Kiba asked, his voice tight with concern. Naruto, what are you talking about? The question pierced through the haze of ancient authority that had been building in Naruto's mind. He blinked, suddenly aware of how the other genin were looking at him, not with the respect due to a teammate, but with the wary attention reserved for potential threats. He began, then stopped. How could he explain that he was remembering being someone else, someone who had ruled over death itself? How could he make them understand that the memories felt more real than his own life? We need to move, Shikamaru said, apparently choosing to ignore the disturbing display. Intelligence suggests Sasuke is traveling with Sound Ninja, Orochimaru's agents. If we're going to catch them, we need to leave now. The mention of Orochimaru triggered a cascade of memory and recognition. The Sannin's spiritual pressure, his interest in transcendence, the way he had looked at Sasuke with hungry calculation, all of it pointed to a pattern that Baraggan had seen before. He's not just leaving, Naruto said with sudden certainty. He's being recruited. Orochimaru doesn't collect subordinates, he creates them, shapes them, transforms them into extensions of his will. How do you know that? Neji asked. Because I've seen it before, Naruto replied, and his voice carried the weight of eons. Aizen Sasuke used similar methods, identifying those with potential, offering them power beyond their imagination, then binding them to his service through a combination of gratitude and dependency. The name meant nothing to the other genin, but the certainty in Naruto's tone was unmistakable. He wasn't speculating or theorizing, he was remembering. They set out within the hour, moving through the forests beyond Konoha with tactical precision that would have impressed most jounin. But as they traveled, Naruto found himself increasingly isolated from his companions, not physically, but spiritually. The memories of kingship brought with them an emotional distance that made it difficult to relate to his teammates' concerns. Their worry about Sasuke's well-being, their determination to bring him back safely, all of it felt foreign to someone who remembered viewing subordinates as expendable resources. But there was something else as well, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. The idea of Sasuke, his rival, his teammate, someone he had begun to think of as genuinely important, choosing to abandon everything they had built together felt like a personal betrayal. Not just disappointing, but insulting. How dare a subordinate choose to leave his service without permission? The thought horrified him even as he recognized its accuracy. He was beginning to see his teammates not as friends and equals, but as subjects whose primary value lay in their loyalty to him. It was a perspective that belonged to Baraggan, not Naruto Uzumaki. But the line between the two was becoming increasingly blurred. They caught up with the Sound 4 at sunset, in a clearing that showed signs of recent combat. The enemy ninja were arranged in defensive positions around Sasuke, who lay unconscious in what appeared to be some kind of sealed container. Finally, Tahyuya said, her red hair catching the dying light, "We were starting to think you guys weren't coming." "Release Sasuke," Shikamaru demanded, his shadow already stretching toward their opponents. "This doesn't have to end in violence." "Violence?" Sakon laughed, his voice carrying undertones that suggested the presence of his parasitic brother. "We're hoping it ends in violence. It's been too long since we had a real challenge." The Sound Ninja's casual confidence triggered something primal in Naruto's consciousness. In his memories, he had dealt with countless subordinates who had forgotten their place, who had needed to be reminded of the consequences of disrespect. When he stepped forward, his movement carried the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room. His spiritual pressure began to build, and the clearing's vegetation started showing signs of accelerated aging. "You dare speak of violence to a king?" he asked, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air vibrate. "You dare threaten one who has commanded armies that span dimensions?" The Sound 4's confident expressions faltered as they found themselves facing something that radiated authority and menace in equal measure. The spiritual pressure rolling off Naruto was unlike anything they had encountered. Not just powerful, but ancient, carrying undertones that spoke of experiences far beyond normal human comprehension. "What the hell are you?" Kidomaru breathed, his 6 arms moving instinctively to defensive positions. "I am the end of all things," Naruto replied with cold certainty. "I am the slow decay that claims kingdoms, the entropy that reduces mountains to dust. I am Baraggan, God King of Huko Mundo, and you have made the mistake of standing between me and what belongs to me." The declaration hung in the air like a challenge. Around the clearing, ancient trees began to show signs of stress, bark cracking, leaves browning and falling, the rich scent of growing things replaced by the dry smell of endings. "Naruto," Shikamaru said carefully, his voice tight with concern, "what's happening to you?" But Naruto was beyond hearing. The sight of Sasuke unconscious and helpless, being carried away by enemies who dared to claim ownership of someone under his protection, had triggered responses that belonged to someone who had never tolerated challenges to his authority. He raised one hand, fingers spread, and simply exhaled. The breath that escaped his lips carried with it the weight of centuries, the patient dissolution that claimed all things in time. Where it touched, the very forest began to age rapidly, wood becoming brittle and gray, stone cracking and crumbling, the air itself taking on the thick, oppressive quality of something ancient and tired. The Sound 4 didn't even try to fight. They scattered, abandoning their formation and their unconscious prisoner in favor of simple survival. Whatever they had been prepared for, it wasn't this, wasn't facing something that could age the very environment around it through presence alone. "Impossible," Jirobo gasped as he dodged behind a tree that immediately began to wither and decay. "No human can do that." "I am not human," Naruto replied conversationally, his voice carrying across the clearing with supernatural clarity. "I am what your kind becomes when mortality is transcended, when power reaches levels that reshape reality itself." He gestured dismissively, and the tree Jirobo was hiding behind crumbled to ash, leaving the sound ninja exposed and terrified. But it was Shikamaru's voice that finally broke through the haze of absolute power that had consumed Naruto's consciousness. "This isn't you," his teammate said, his voice carrying desperate conviction. "I don't know what's happening, but this isn't who Naruto Uzumaki is." The words pierced through Naruto's royal certainty like a blade. He looked around at the devastation he had wrought, at the withered trees, the cracked ground, the terror in his enemy's eyes, and felt something that might have been shame. "You're right," he whispered, his voice returning to its normal register. "This isn't me. This is someone else, someone I'm becoming whether I want to or not." The oppressive spiritual pressure dissipated like morning mist, leaving behind only a 12-year-old boy who looked as confused and frightened as his enemies. The Sound Four, recognizing an opportunity, immediately moved to reclaim their prisoner. But they had underestimated the resolve of Konoha's retrieval team, and the battle that followed was brutal and decisive. When the dust settled, 3 of the Sound Ninja lay unconscious, while Tahuya had fled deeper into the forest with Sasuke still in tow. The pursuing team regrouped quickly, but Naruto found himself hanging back, reluctant to continue. "What's wrong?" Neji asked, his Byakugan still active from the recent combat. "I almost killed them," Naruto said quietly. "Not in self-defense, not to protect anyone, but because they dared to show disrespect to someone they saw as superior. That's not who I want to be. But it's who you're becoming," Shikamaru observed, his voice carefully neutral. The statement hung between them like an accusation. Naruto wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that he was still the same person who had graduated from the academy with dreams of becoming Hokage. But the evidence was mounting that something fundamental was changing in his nature. "We need to keep moving," he said finally. "Sasuke is still out there, and whatever's happening to me, I won't let it stop me from bringing him home." They caught up with Tahuya at the border of the Land of Fire, where she had stopped to await reinforcements that would never come. The final confrontation took place in a valley that seemed designed for dramatic battles, steep cliffs on either side, a narrow passage that limited tactical options, and an atmosphere heavy with impending violence. "You're too late," Tahuya said, her voice carrying grim satisfaction. "Sasuke-kun has already made his choice. He's embracing the power Lord Orochimaru offers, leaving behind the weakness that held him back in your pathetic village." As if summoned by her words, the sealed container began to crack and split. The spiritual pressure that emerged was familiar yet wrong, definitely Sasuke, but twisted by something dark and hungry and fundamentally corrupting. When the Uchiha finally emerged, his appearance had changed dramatically. His skin was pale and cold, his hair had grown longer and darker, and his eyes held a hunger that belonged to something that had never known satisfaction. But it was the markings on his skin that made Naruto's enhanced senses scream warnings. The curse mark had spread across half of Sasuke's body, creating patterns that resembled wings or flames, or the shadows cast by something too terrible to look at directly. "Sasuke," Naruto said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and horror. "Thank God you're alive." "Alive," Sasuke repeated, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to something beyond normal human experience. "I'm more than alive, Naruto. I'm becoming something greater than human, something that transcends the limitations that held me back." The words were eerily similar to ones Naruto had spoken himself, and the recognition sent a chill through his consciousness. This was what Orochimaru had offered, not just power, but transformation into something beyond mortal limitations. "You're letting that thing control you," Naruto said, gesturing toward the curse mark that covered half of Sasuke's body. "That's not power, that's slavery," says the boy who talks to himself about being a king, Sasuke replied with cold amusement. "At least I chose my transformation." "What's your excuse?" The question cut deeper than any physical wound could have. What was his excuse? He claimed to be fighting against the memories and personality of Baraggan Luisenbern, but wasn't he also embracing them? Using the power they brought, accepting the knowledge they offered. "My excuse," Naruto said finally, "is that I'm trying to stay human despite what's happening to me. You're trying to stop being human because of what happened to you." "And which of us is happier with the results?" Sasuke asked. Before Naruto could answer, Sasuke moved with speed that bordered on teleportation. His attack was precise, clinical, enhanced by power that carried the same corrupting spiritual pressure as Orochimaru's own techniques. The battle that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. Sasuke fought with ruthless efficiency, every technique enhanced by the curse mark's power, every movement flowing naturally into the next, as if choreographed by centuries of combat experience. His Sharingan spun frantically, trying to track movements that seemed to bend the laws of physics. But Naruto fought like something that had been at war since before human civilization began. Every technique was executed with perfect tactical awareness, every movement designed not just to defeat his opponent, but to demonstrate absolute superiority. His spiritual pressure rolled outward in waves, and wherever it touched, the battlefield began to age, stone cracking, vegetation withering, the very air becoming thick and oppressive. "This is what you could become," Sasuke said as they exchanged blows that created shockwaves felt miles away. "Stop pretending to be something you're not. Embrace what you are." "What I am," Naruto replied, deflecting a technique that should have been impossible to counter, "is someone who protects the people he cares about, even if they're too stupid to realize they need protection." "Protection?" Sasuke laughed, and the sound carried undertones that belonged to something that had never known mercy. "You want to control them just like I want power. At least I'm honest about it." The accusation hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Was his desire to protect people really different from wanting to control them? When he looked at his teammates, his friends, the civilians of Konoha, did he see individuals worthy of respect, or subjects whose primary value lay in their loyalty to him? The question was still echoing in his mind when Sasuke's next attack broke through his defenses. The Chidori that struck his chest carried with it not just lightning-based chakra, but spiritual pressure that felt familiar, the same corrupting influence he could sense from Orochimaru himself. As Naruto staggered backward, he could feel something fundamental shifting in his consciousness. The pain, the shock of betrayal, the realization that someone he had trusted was willing to kill him, all of it combined to trigger memories of another betrayal, another moment when absolute trust had been rewarded with mortal treachery. When he straightened, his posture carried the regal bearing of someone who had learned never to make the same mistake twice. "You want to see what I really am?" he asked, and his voice carried harmonics that made the valley itself seem to hold its breath. "You want to understand the power I've been holding back?" The spiritual pressure that rolled off him was unlike anything the ninja world had ever recorded. Not just powerful, but old, ancient beyond human comprehension, carrying with it the weight of eons spent ruling over concepts themselves. When he spoke again, his words carried such absolute authority that the very air seemed to crystallize around them. "I am Baraggan Luxenbern, God King of Huko Mundo, aspect of death itself given form and will. I have ruled since before your bloodline drew breath, commanded armies that spanned dimensions, and survived betrayals that would have destroyed lesser beings." As he spoke, his appearance began to change. His blonde hair darkened to silver, his blue eyes became gold and ancient, and something that might have been a crown began to materialize above his brow, not solid, but suggested, a shadow cast by power too great to be fully contained in mortal form. "You think Orochimaru's corruption makes you strong?" he continued, taking a step forward. Where his foot touched the ground, stone began to age and crack. "You think borrowing power from a snake makes you transcendent? Let me show you what real transformation looks like." He raised one hand, fingers spread, and for just a moment the battlefield was filled with the sound of thousands of voices crying out in worship and terror, the echoes of armies that had once knelt before his throne. But it was Sasuke's response that changed everything. Instead of fleeing, instead of backing down in the face of power that existed beyond mortal comprehension, the Uchiha smiled. Not with fear or desperation, but with genuine satisfaction. "There," he said, his voice carrying cold triumph, "now you're being honest about what you are." The words hit Naruto like a physical blow. In revealing his true nature, in embracing the memories and power of Baraggan Luxenbern, hadn't he just proven Sasuke's point? Hadn't he demonstrated that beneath all his talk of protection and friendship, he was exactly what his former teammate claimed, someone who wanted control above all else? "You're wrong," Naruto whispered, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Sasuke asked, his curse mark flaring with dark energy. "Look around you, Naruto. Look at what you've done to this place just by existing. Look at how your friends watch you, not with love, but with fear." Naruto turned and saw that the other members of the retrieval team had arrived in time to witness his transformation. Shikamaru's face was pale with shock, Neiji's Byakugan was spinning frantically as it tried to process what it was seeing, and even Lee, eternal optimist Lee, was staring at him with something approaching terror. "This is who you really are," Sasuke continued relentlessly. "A king who demands obedience, a god who expects worship. The only difference between us is that I've stopped pretending otherwise." The accusation cut deeper than any technique could have. Because part of it was true, when he looked at his friends, he did feel a desire for their acknowledgement that went beyond simple friendship. When he considered his future as Hokage, did he really want to serve the people, or did he want them to serve him? No, he said finally, and his voice was purely his own. The difference between us is that I still care about the people I'm supposed to protect. Even if they fear me, even if they don't understand what I am, I won't abandon them. Won't you? Sasuke asked. When they finally realize what you're becoming, when they try to contain you or control you or eliminate you as a threat, will you still protect them then? The question hung in the air like prophecy. Naruto could see the future Sasuke was describing, could imagine the day when Konoha decided that the power growing within him was too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely. On that day, would he submit to their judgment? Or would he remind them, as Baraggan had once reminded his subjects, that kings ruled by right of strength alone? I don't know, he admitted, and the honesty in his voice seemed to surprise them both. At least you're being truthful, Sasuke said with something that might have been approval. But I won't wait to find out. I choose power on my own terms, freedom to become whatever I'm capable of becoming, even if it means hurting the people who care about you. Especially then, Sasuke replied with cold certainty. Bonds are chains, Naruto. They hold you back from your true potential. The philosophy was one that Baraggan would have understood perfectly, power unconstrained by sentiment, ambition untempered by loyalty. It was the path that led to ultimate strength and absolute isolation. Then we really are different, Naruto said sadly, because the bonds I've formed, they're not chains, they're anchors. They keep me from becoming something I'd regret being. We'll see, Sasuke said, his form beginning to fade as distance techniques carried him away from the battlefield. When you finally stop fighting what you are, when you embrace your true nature completely, we'll see if those bonds can hold. And then he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering spiritual pressure of Orochimaru's corruption and the echo of words that might have been prophecy. The journey back to Konoha was conducted in tense silence. Naruto's teammates maintained careful distance, not out of anger but out of instinctive caution. They had seen what he was capable of becoming, had witnessed the transformation that turned their friend into something ancient and terrible. "Are you still you?" Shikamaru asked as they reached the village gates. Naruto considered the question seriously. Was he still Naruto Uzumaki, or was he becoming Baraggan Loisenbern wearing Naruto's face? "I don't know," he replied honestly, "but I'm trying to be." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was the truth, and for now, truth was all he had to offer. As they entered Konoha, Naruto could feel the weight of his failure settling on his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked to wear. Sasuke was gone, probably forever. His true nature had been revealed to his teammates, possibly ending those relationships as well. And the power growing within him showed no signs of slowing its relentless advance. But there was something else as well, a determination that belonged purely to Naruto Uzumaki, not to the God King whose memories he carried. He would find a way to bring Sasuke back, not through force or authority, but through the bonds that Sasuke claimed were chains. And he would find a way to be both the protector he wanted to be and the king his memories insisted he was. Because the alternative, becoming exactly what Sasuke had accused him of being, was a price he was not willing to pay. The boy who wanted acknowledgement and the God King who commanded worship would have to learn to coexist. Because in the end, they were both part of the same person, and that person had promises to keep. 2.5 years had passed since Sasuke's defection, and Naruto Uzumaki returned to Konoha as someone fundamentally changed by more than just training and experience. The boy who had left with Jiraiya still struggled with awakening memories of godhood. The young man who walked through the village gates had learned to make those memories serve him rather than control him. The transformation was immediately apparent to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive spiritual pressure. Where once Naruto's power had been wild and uncontrolled, now it moved with the disciplined precision of someone who had learned to balance two very different natures. The cheerful determination remained, but it was tempered by something deeper, an understanding of authority that came from remembering what it meant to rule. "You look different," Sakura said during their reunion at Ikaraku Ramen, though she seemed unable to articulate exactly what had changed. "Training will do that," Naruto replied with a smile that carried just a hint of something ancient. Jiraiya-sensei was thorough in his instruction. The understatement barely covered the reality of what those 2.5 years had contained. Jiraiya had recognized almost immediately that his student was dealing with something beyond normal ninja development and had adjusted his training accordingly. "The power you're manifesting," the Toad Sage had said during their first month together, "it reminds me of something I encountered during my travels. Something that shouldn't exist in our world but apparently does." "What kind of something?" Naruto had asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Spiritual beings," Jiraiya had replied carefully. "Entities that exist beyond the normal boundaries of life and death, that command powers over fundamental concepts rather than mere chakra manipulation." The revelation had led to months of intensive study, not just of ninja techniques, but of the theoretical frameworks that governed spiritual existence. Jiraiya had contacts in places that most ninja never knew existed, scholars who studied the intersection between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. Through them, Naruto had learned about the concept of reincarnation across dimensional boundaries, about souls so powerful that death could not entirely contain them, about the delicate balance required to maintain individual identity while accepting inherited memories. "The key," one elderly monk had explained during a particularly difficult lesson, "is not to fight the memories or embrace them completely, but to integrate them into your existing sense of self. You are not Baraggan Luisenbairn reborn, you are Naruto Uzumaki who carries the experiences of a god king. The distinction matters more than you might think." It had taken months to truly understand what he meant, years to put the theory into practice. But the results were undeniable. Naruto could now access Baraggan's memories and knowledge without losing himself in them, could channel that ancient power without becoming consumed by its inherent arrogance. The technique he had developed, which Jiraiya had dubbed Senescentia Sage Mode after witnessing its first successful manifestation, represented the perfect fusion of everything he had learned. "Show me," Kakashi said 3 days after their return, when they had gathered in a remote training ground for Team 7's official reunion. Naruto nodded, closing his eyes and reaching for the natural energy that permeated all living things. But instead of simply absorbing it as traditional Sage Mode required, he filtered it through the memories and understanding that belonged to a being who had commanded time itself. When he opened his eyes, they had taken on the golden hue of Sage Mode, but with pupils that held depths no human gaze should possess. Orange pigmentation appeared around his eyes, but it was tinged with silver that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. Most dramatically, his spiritual pressure had changed, still recognizably Naruto's, but carrying undertones that spoke of experiences far beyond mortal comprehension. "Fascinating," Kakashi murmured, his Sharingan spinning as it tried to analyze what it was seeing. "Your chakra signature has multiple layers now, human, sage, and something else entirely." "The something else is what I inherited," Naruto explained, his voice carrying harmonics that made the words feel like physical weight. "Memories, knowledge, and power from someone who ruled over concepts rather than people." To demonstrate, he gestured toward a nearby boulder. Instead of shattering under an impact or crumbling from applied force, the stone simply aged. Stress fractures appeared and widened, the surface became pitted and worn, and within seconds the entire mass had weathered away to dust. "Selective entropy," he continued conversationally. "I can accelerate the natural aging process of anything I choose, from individual objects to entire battlefields. But the power is completely under my conscious control now, no more accidental aging when I get emotional." Sakura's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and concern. That's not a technique any human should be able to perform." "You're right," Naruto agreed, "but I'm not entirely human anymore. I'm something new, a fusion of mortal determination and immortal experience." The words should have been boastful, should have carried the arrogance that had once marked his partial transformations. Instead, they were simply factual, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to accept his nature without being consumed by it. "And you can control it?" Kakashi asked, though his visible eye remained fixed on his student with laser intensity. "Watch," Naruto said. He moved into a combat stance, and for just a moment his teammates could see both versions of him simultaneously. The 12-year-old boy who had sworn to bring Sasuke home, and the ancient god king who had commanded armies across dimensions. Then the two images merged, creating something that was somehow greater than either alone. The demonstration that followed showcased abilities that belonged to no single tradition. Sage Jutsu enhanced by millennia of combat experience, shadow clones that flickered in and out of temporal phase, taijutsu forms that incorporated defensive techniques designed for beings who could manipulate time itself. But most importantly, it was all unmistakably Naruto. The techniques carried his determination, his refusal to give up, his absolute commitment to protecting the people he cared about. The ancient power served those ideals rather than corrupting them. Incredible, Kakashi said when the demonstration concluded. You've managed to achieve something I didn't think was possible, true integration between conflicting natures. It wasn't easy, Naruto admitted, his appearance returning to normal as he disengaged the technique. There were times when I thought the memories would overwhelm me, when I nearly lost myself in recollections of absolute authority. But Jiraiya helped me understand that I didn't have to choose between being Naruto or being Baraggan. I could be both. And now, Sakura asked quietly. Now I'm ready to fulfill the promises I made, Naruto replied with quiet certainty, starting with bringing Sasuke home. The opportunity to put his new abilities to the test came sooner than expected. The Akatsuki, the organization of S-rank criminals that had been operating in shadows for years, finally made their move against the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki. Deidara and Sasori arrived in Konoha under cover of darkness, their mission simple. Capture Naruto Uzumaki alive and extract the demon fox sealed within him. What they found instead was something that existed beyond their ability to categorize or counter. The battle began in the forest surrounding Konoha, where Deidara's explosive clay techniques should have given him overwhelming tactical advantage. His birds and spiders carried enough destructive force to level city blocks, and his ability to fly put him beyond the reach of most ground-based ninja. But Naruto's enhanced senses, sharpened by memories of aerial combat across dimensions, tracked the bomber's movements with casual precision. More importantly, his new abilities offered solutions to problems that would have stymied his younger self. Clay, huh? Naruto said as he dodged another wave of explosive sculptures. Interesting choice of weapon, but clay is just earth mixed with water and time is my domain. He gestured upward and Deidara's clay bird simply stopped working, not destroyed by counter techniques or disrupted by opposing chakra, but aged beyond functionality. The carefully balanced chakra that gave them explosive potential decayed into inert matter, and the sculptures crumbled to dust before they could detonate. Impossible, Deidara snarled from his aerial mount. My art is eternal, it cannot be diminished by such mundane. His words cut off as he realized his giant clay bird was beginning to show signs of stress. Cracks appeared in its wings, its flight became increasingly unstable, and the chakra network that animated it started to fail. Nothing is eternal, Naruto replied, his voice carrying undertones that belonged to someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Everything ages, everything decays, everything returns to dust in time. I simply accelerate the process. When Deidara's mount finally crumbled, sending the bomber plummeting toward the forest floor, Naruto was there to meet him, not with the wild aggression of his youth, but with tactical precision that incorporated centuries of combat experience. The taijutsu exchange that followed was brutally one-sided. Deidara was skilled, certainly, but his techniques were designed for long-range combat. In close quarters, facing an opponent who could age his weapons to uselessness and whose enhanced speed made him nearly impossible to track, the bomber found himself hopelessly outmatched. You're not human, Deidara gasped as Naruto's enhanced strength sent him skidding across the forest floor. No, Naruto agreed calmly. I'm something more than human, something that incorporates human ideals with power that transcends mortal limitations. And that power is telling me that you've made a very serious mistake. The spiritual pressure that rolled off him was carefully controlled but unmistakably threatening. Unlike his earlier, uncontrolled manifestations, this was power wielded with surgical precision, enough to make his point without causing collateral damage. Sasori, Deidara called out, his voice tight with desperation. I could use some assistance here. The puppet master's response came in the form of the third Kazekage, the most powerful of his human puppet collection. The iron sand techniques that emerged from the undead cage should have been overwhelming, creating a battlefield control that would have challenged even elite jounin. But Naruto had spent 2.5 years learning to apply Baraggan's memories to ninja combat, and those memories included encounters with opponents who could manipulate metal and magnetism with far greater skill than any human puppeteer. Iron sand, he mused, studying the approaching techniques with academic interest. Impressive control, but iron is just another form of matter, and all matter is subject to entropy. He reached out with his enhanced senses, not toward the iron sand itself, but toward the chakra strings that controlled it. And there, in the delicate networks of spiritual energy that gave the puppet its animation, he found his target. Chakra, like everything else, was subject to the passage of time. It could be aged, weakened, degraded until it could no longer maintain its intended form. The technique required incredible precision, too little effect and the strings would remain functional, too much and the backlash might kill the puppeteer. But Naruto had memories of performing far more delicate operations, of manipulating spiritual energy on scales that dwarfed anything the ninja world had ever recorded. The third Kazekage simply stopped. Not destroyed, not disrupted, but rendered inert as the chakra that animated it aged beyond functionality. The iron sand fell to the ground in lifeless heaps, and the puppet collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut. "My masterpiece," Sasori breathed, his voice carrying genuine shock. "You destroyed my greatest work." "I didn't destroy it," Naruto corrected, his tone almost gentle. "I simply reminded it that all things have their time, and its time had passed." The philosophical distinction was lost on the puppet master, who responded by unleashing his entire collection in a desperate assault. Dozens of human puppets, each carrying the techniques and abilities of their former lives, filled the battlefield with a coordinated attack that would have overwhelmed most opponents. But Naruto moved through them with fluid grace, his enhanced speed allowing him to engage multiple opponents simultaneously, while his aging abilities neutralized their weapons and techniques. It wasn't a battle so much as a systematic dismantling, conducted with the kind of tactical precision that came from centuries of warfare experience. When the last puppet fell, aged beyond repair, Sasori emerged from his mechanical shell with desperate fury. His true body, preserved by his puppet techniques, represented the culmination of his life's work, a form that should have been immune to conventional attacks. "You think your aging techniques can affect me?" he snarled, his preserved flesh gleaming in the filtered sunlight. "I am eternal, I have transcended the weakness of mortality." "Have you?" Naruto asked, and there was something almost pitying in his tone. "You've preserved your flesh, yes, but what about your soul? What about the spiritual energy that gives that flesh meaning?" He didn't attack with fists or techniques, didn't rely on the overwhelming force that had characterized his earlier battles. Instead, he simply looked at Sasori with eyes that held the depth of eons. The puppet master staggered backward as he found himself facing something that radiated authority on a fundamental level, not the authority of rank or position, but the deeper authority that came from understanding the true nature of existence itself. "You fear death," Naruto continued, his voice carrying harmonics that made the words feel like revelation. "You've spent your entire existence trying to escape it, to preserve yourself against the natural order. But death isn't your enemy, Sasori, it's simply another transition, another phase of existence." "You don't understand," Sasori protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "Death is meaningless, art is eternal." "Nothing is eternal," Naruto interrupted gently. "Even gods die eventually, even kings fall to betrayal and time, but that doesn't make existence meaningless, it makes it precious." The words carried weight that went beyond philosophy. In his memories, Baraggan had spent millennia trying to escape the same fate that Sasori feared, had convinced himself that power could make him truly immortal. It had taken death itself to teach him otherwise. "I've been where you are," Naruto continued, his voice soft with understanding. "I've remembered what it feels like to believe that power could make you invulnerable, that sufficient control could keep you safe from every threat. But safety isn't the point, living is." "Living," Sasori repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Living," Naruto confirmed. "Forming bonds, accepting vulnerability, choosing to care about things that might be taken away. It's terrifying and beautiful and utterly worth the risk." For a moment, something flickered in Sasori's preserved features, not quite human emotion, but perhaps the memory of it. Then his expression hardened again, and he launched himself forward in a final, desperate attack. Naruto caught him without apparent effort, his enhanced strength easily overwhelming the puppet master's preserved form. But instead of counterattacking, instead of using his aging abilities to destroy his opponent, he simply held Sasori still and spoke with quiet conviction. "You don't have to do this," he said. "You don't have to serve people who see you as nothing more than a tool. You could choose differently." "Choose," Sasori laughed bitterly. "I chose long ago. I chose art over humanity, perfection over vulnerability." "And how has that worked out for you?" Naruto asked seriously. "Are you happy? Are you fulfilled? Do you wake up each day eager to see what it might bring?" The questions hung in the air like challenges. Sasori was quiet for a long moment, his preserved features showing signs of internal struggle. "No," he admitted finally. "I am empty, complete but hollow, perfect but meaningless." "Then choose again," Naruto urged. "It's never too late to choose differently." but even as he spoke, he could sense other spiritual pressures approaching, reinforcements from both sides, drawn by the massive display of power that had marked their battle. The moment for philosophical conversion was passing, and Sasori seemed to recognize it as well. "Perhaps," the puppet master said quietly, "in another life I might have made different choices. But in this one, I am what I am." He triggered some kind of technique, probably a suicide attack designed to take them both down. But Naruto was ready for it, his enhanced senses having detected the buildup of chakra long before it reached critical levels. The aging effect he applied was surgical in its precision, not enough to kill Sasori instantly, but enough to disrupt the technique before it could reach full power. The puppet master collapsed, his preserved form finally succumbing to the weight of years he had been avoiding for decades. "Thank you," Sasori whispered as his consciousness faded, "for reminding me what it felt like to be human." When Kakashi and the reinforcement team arrived minutes later, they found Naruto standing in a forest that showed signs of incredible battle, craters from explosive techniques, scattered puppet parts, and the strange patches of aged vegetation that marked the use of his entropy abilities. "Status report," Kakashi said, his visible eye taking in the scene with professional assessment. "2 Akatsuki operatives neutralized," Naruto replied calmly. "Deidara fled after losing his aerial mount, but he's wounded and shouldn't be a threat for some time. Sasori," he gestured toward the puppet master's still form. "He chose his own ending." "And you?" Kakashi asked, studying his former student with careful attention. "How do you feel?" Naruto considered the question seriously. The battle had been his first real test of the integrated abilities he had developed, his first chance to apply Baraggan's memories and power to a situation that mattered. The results had been everything he had hoped for and more. "Like myself," he said finally. "Like someone who's learned to balance what he was with what he wants to become." The answer seemed to satisfy Kakashi, though the older ninja's expression remained thoughtful as they began the journey back to Konoha. But as they traveled, Naruto found his thoughts turning to the broader implications of what had happened. The Akatsuki had made their first move against him, which meant they would make others. And somewhere out there, Sasuke was still lost in Orochimaru's corruption, still convinced that power mattered more than the bonds that connected him to other people. The boy who wanted acknowledgement and the God King who commanded respect had learned to work together. Now it was time to put that partnership to its ultimate test, bringing home someone who had chosen to walk away from everything they had once shared. The path ahead would be difficult, dangerous, and probably painful. But Naruto Uzumaki had never been one to back down from a challenge, and Baraggan Luisenbern had never accepted defeat as final. Together, they would find a way to keep the promises that mattered most, no matter what it cost them. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with impending catastrophe. Naruto was in the middle of his daily training routine when the Toad summons brought word from Mount Myaboku. Pain, the leader of the Akatsuki, was moving against Konoha with overwhelming force. "How many?" Naruto asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be worse than anything they had prepared for. 6, Fukasaku replied grimly. 6 beings, each carrying the Rinnegan, each wielding power that defies conventional understanding. They've already neutralized the outer defenses and are moving toward the village center. The news should have sent Naruto into his usual explosive rush toward action. Instead, he found himself studying the tactical implications with cold calculation that belonged to someone else. 6 opponents with identical eyes, coordinated assault patterns, overwhelming power. It was a strategy he recognized from memories that belonged to someone who had both employed and countered similar approaches. "The Rinnegan," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made the air itself seem heavier. "I've seen eyes like that before." "When?" Fukasaku asked, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "In another life," Naruto replied, and the words carried weight that went beyond metaphor. Worn by someone who believed himself to be God, who sought to remake the world according to his vision of perfection. The memories were crystallizing now, becoming more vivid than they had ever been. He could see Aizen Sasuke clearly, could remember the way the former Soul Reaper captain had carried himself with absolute certainty in his own superiority. The spiritual pressure, the casual dismissal of opposition, the eyes that seemed to look through reality itself, all of it was echoing in the reports of Pain's assault on Konoha. "We need to get back," Naruto said, but even as he spoke, he could feel something fundamental shifting in his consciousness. The threat to his home, to the people he had sworn to protect, was triggering responses that belonged to someone who had once faced similar challenges on a vastly different scale. The journey back to Konoha took place in Sage mode, his enhanced speed carrying him across the landscape faster than any normal travel method could have managed. But as they approached the village, what he saw stopped him cold. The destruction was absolute. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by techniques that operated beyond normal scales of power, and an enormous crater where the Hokage Tower had once stood. But it was the spiritual pressure that truly marked the scope of what had happened, traces of power that existed beyond mortal comprehension, echoes of techniques that reshaped reality itself. "No," he whispered, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to someone who had witnessed the fall of kingdoms. "Not again." The words triggered a cascade of memory so vivid that he staggered under its weight. He could see La's notches burning, could remember the day Aizen's rebellion had torn through his kingdom like wildfire, could feel again the rage and helplessness that had consumed him as everything he had built crumbled to ash. But this was different. La's notches had been his kingdom, populated by creatures who served him out of fear and necessity. Konoha was his home, filled with people who had shown him kindness when no one else would, who had given him the bonds that made existence meaningful. "Naruto," Fukasaku said carefully, his voice tight with concern, "your chakra, it's changing." The old toad was right. The spiritual pressure radiating from Naruto was unlike anything he had manifested before, not wild and uncontrolled like his early transformations, but focused with laser intensity. Around him, the air began to take on the oppressive quality of something ancient and terrible, and the ground beneath his feet started showing signs of accelerated aging. "Where is he?" Naruto asked, his voice carrying authority that made the question feel like a command from something that expected immediate obedience. "The center of the village," Fukasaku replied, though his usual confidence had been replaced by obvious unease. "But Naruto, you need to be careful. The power you're manifesting is exactly what this situation requires," Naruto finished, his eyes scanning the destroyed landscape with tactical precision that incorporated centuries of warfare experience. "I've faced beings like this before. I know what it takes to defeat them." He moved through the ruined streets with fluid grace, his enhanced senses tracking the spiritual pressures that marked active combat zones. What he found was a battlefield that existed beyond normal scales of conflict. Techniques that carved mountain-sized gouges in the earth, jutsu that seemed to bend the laws of physics, and at the center of it all, a figure whose presence dominated everything around him. Pain stood in the crater that had once been the village center, his orange hair and pierced features instantly recognizable from intelligence reports. But it was his eyes that made Naruto's enhanced perception scream warnings, the Rinnegan, swirling with power that seemed to look through reality itself. "So," Pain said without turning around, his voice carrying the same casual authority that Naruto remembered from another time, another enemy. "The Ninetales Jinchuriki finally arrives. I was beginning to think you had abandoned your village to its fate." The comment triggered something primal in Naruto's consciousness. The suggestion that he would abandon the people under his protection, that he would fail in his duty as their defender, struck at insecurities that belonged to both of his natures. "I would never abandon them," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the ruined buildings around them seem to age even further. "They are mine to protect." "Yours," Pain repeated, finally turning to face him. When their eyes met, Naruto felt a shock of recognition that went beyond the physical. Those eyes, that spiritual pressure, the absolute certainty in his own righteousness. It was like looking at Aizen Sasuke wearing a different face. "Yes," Naruto replied with cold certainty. "My people, my village, my responsibility, and you have violated the sacred trust that binds a ruler to his subjects." The words should have sounded strange coming from someone who claimed to fight for democracy and freedom. Instead, they carried such absolute conviction that even Pain seemed taken aback. "A ruler?" Pain asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. "How interesting. Most Jinchuriki think of themselves as weapons or victims. You think of yourself as something more." "I am something more," Naruto replied, and as he spoke, his appearance began to change. His blonde hair darkened to silver, his blue eyes became gold and ancient, and something that might have been a crown began to materialize above his brow, not solid but suggested, a shadow cast by power too great to be fully contained in mortal form. "I am Baraggan Luxenbairn, God King of Huko sovereign of entropy and decay. I have ruled since before your bloodline drew breath, commanded armies that spanned dimensions, and survived betrayals that would have destroyed lesser beings." The declaration carried with it spiritual pressure that made the very air crystallize. Around them, the already damaged buildings began to show signs of advanced aging. stone cracking and crumbling, metal rusting and failing, the very ground becoming brittle and gray. "And I recognize you," Naruto continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of someone who had commanded concepts themselves. "You carry the same spiritual signature as another who believed himself to be God, who sought to remake reality according to his vision." Aizen Sasuke thought himself beyond the reach of consequence as well. Pain's expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. "You speak of events I know nothing about, yet your power, it is unlike anything I have encountered." "What are you?" "I am what you will become if you continue down your current path," Naruto replied with cold certainty. "I am the end result of absolute power unchecked by wisdom, of authority exercised without understanding its cost." He gestured toward the ruined village around them. "This destruction you've wrought, do you believe it serves justice? Do you think reducing my home to rubble will somehow create peace?" "Pain is the only truth," Pain replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had never questioned his own righteousness. "Only through experiencing loss can humanity understand the value of peace. Only through suffering can they learn to—" "Stop," Naruto interrupted, his voice carrying such authority that even Pain's certainty seemed to waver. "I've heard this philosophy before, from someone who believed that ending meant the same thing as solving. Let me tell you how that story ended." The air around them began to shimmer with heat as Naruto's spiritual pressure continued to build. This wasn't the wild, uncontrolled manifestation of his youth, nor even the disciplined integration he had achieved through training. This was something deeper, the full awakening of memories that had been dormant for decades. Aizen Sasuke convinced himself that he was saving the world by reshaping it according to his vision, Naruto continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. He orchestrated betrayals, manipulated entire civilizations, and destroyed countless lives in service of what he claimed was a greater good. And in the end, he learned the same lesson you're about to learn. "Which is?" Pain asked, though his stance had shifted to something more defensive. "That gods who rule through fear and pain discover that their kingdoms are built on foundations of sand," Naruto replied. "That power without compassion creates only emptiness, and authority without love generates nothing but rebellion." As he spoke, his transformation continued. The suggestion of a crown became more solid, more real, and his spiritual pressure began to take on qualities that existed beyond normal human experience. This wasn't just Sage Mode enhanced by ancient memories. This was something new, something that represented the complete integration of everything he had learned and everything he had been. Senescentia Sage Mode was only the beginning, he said conversationally, his voice now carrying harmonics that made the very air vibrate. "This is what happens when someone who has learned to rule with wisdom faces someone who rules through fear alone." The form that emerged was unlike anything the ninja world had ever recorded. His Sage Mode markers were still there, but they were enhanced by spiritual pressure that spoke of dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. The orange pigmentation around his eyes had become gold and silver, shifting like liquid metal, and his pupils held depths that seemed to contain entire universes. But most dramatically, the crown above his brow was now clearly visible, not made of any earthly material, but constructed from crystallized time itself, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. "God King Mode," he said simply, and the words carried such weight that several of the surrounding buildings completed their collapse just from the spiritual pressure they contained. Pain's expression had shifted from confident superiority to something approaching wariness. "Impossible. No human can manifest spiritual pressure of that magnitude." "You're right," Naruto agreed calmly. "No human can. But I'm not entirely human anymore. I'm something new, something that incorporates mortal ideals with immortal experience." To demonstrate, he gestured toward one of Pain's 6 bodies, the one that had been launching gravitational attacks throughout the battle. Instead of attacking it directly, instead of using overwhelming force, he simply looked at it with eyes that held the weight of eons. The Deva path staggered backward as it found itself facing something that radiated authority on a fundamental level. Not the authority of rank or position, but the deeper authority that came from understanding the true nature of existence itself. "You fear death," Naruto said, his voice carrying the same gentle understanding he had once offered to Sasori. "You've convinced yourself that causing pain will somehow eliminate it, that making others suffer will justify your own losses. But pain isn't wisdom, and suffering isn't truth." "You don't understand," the Deva path protested, though its voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. The world is broken, filled with hatred and conflict that can only be ended through what? Naruto interrupted. Through more hatred, through more conflict, through reducing entire civilizations to ash and calling it peace. He took a step forward, and where his foot touched the ground, something extraordinary happened. Instead of aging and decaying, the rubble began to reverse its deterioration, stone reforming, metal losing its rust, the very air becoming cleaner and more vital. "I've walked the path you're on," Naruto continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I've ruled through fear, commanded through intimidation, and convinced myself that absolute power justified any action. And do you know what I learned?" "What?" the Deva Path asked, though its voice was barely above a whisper. "That the strongest kingdoms are built not on fear, but on trust. That true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to create. That a king who rules through love will always triumph over a god who rules through pain." The words carried spiritual pressure that made reality itself seem to bend around them. But this wasn't the oppressive weight of dominance, it was something entirely different, something that spoke of protection rather than conquest, of healing rather than destruction. "I don't believe you," the Deva Path said, but its voice carried none of its earlier certainty. "Then let me show you," Naruto replied. What followed wasn't a battle in any conventional sense. It was a demonstration of power that operated on principles entirely different from anything Pain had encountered. Where the Rinnegan user relied on techniques that destroyed and dominated, Naruto's abilities seemed focused on restoration and protection. His aging powers, instead of being used to destroy, were employed to reverse damage, buildings reforming, rubble returning to its original state, even the massive crater beginning to fill itself in as time moved backward in localized areas. But more than that, his spiritual pressure began to affect the very nature of the battlefield. Where once there had been only destruction and despair, now there was something else. Hope, possibility, the sense that even the most terrible damage could be healed given enough time and wisdom. "This is impossible," the Deva Path said, its voice tight with disbelief. "No technique can reverse damage on this scale." "You're thinking too small," Naruto replied, his voice carrying gentle amusement. "You're focused on techniques, on jutsu, on the manipulation of chakra. But what I'm doing goes deeper than that. I'm manipulating the concepts that underlie reality itself." To demonstrate, he reached out toward one of the other pain bodies, the one that had been absorbing chakra throughout their encounter. Instead of attacking it, instead of trying to destroy it, he simply touched it. The effect was immediate and profound. The Preda Path staggered backward, its eyes wide with shock, as it found itself experiencing something it had never felt before, not pain, not fear, but genuine compassion. For just an instant, it could see through Naruto's eyes, could understand what it felt like to care about something more than power or ideology. "You're lonely," Naruto said with sudden understanding. "All of you, you're fragments of someone who lost everything and convinced himself that sharing that loss would somehow make it meaningful." The observation cut deeper than any physical attack could have. The Deva Path's expression shifted from wariness to something approaching vulnerability. "You don't understand," it said, but the words carried more grief than conviction. "The world is cruel, filled with injustice and suffering that can only be ended through more suffering," Naruto finished gently. "No, that's not how it works. Suffering doesn't create wisdom, it creates more suffering. But compassion creates hope." He gestured toward the village around them, and wherever his influence touched, signs of life began to return. Not just physical restoration, but something deeper. The sense that even the most terrible damage could be healed, that even the most broken situations could be made whole again. "I've remembered what it's like to rule through fear," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I've commanded armies, crushed rebellions, and convinced myself that absolute authority was the only way to maintain order. And do you know what I discovered?" "What?" the Deva Path asked, though its voice was barely audible. "That fear-based rule is the weakest form of government possible. It requires constant vigilance, constant violence, constant proof that the ruler deserves to be obeyed. But rule based on trust, on genuine care for one's subjects, that creates loyalty that survives any challenge." The spiritual pressure radiating from him was no longer oppressive or dominating. Instead, it was protective, nurturing, carrying with it the promise that no matter how dark things became, there was always hope for redemption and healing. "This power you're using," the Deva Path said, its voice tight with confusion. "It's not meant for destruction." "No," Naruto agreed. "It's meant for exactly the opposite. I've learned to use the authority of kingship not to dominate but to protect, not to destroy but to heal." Not to inspire fear, but to generate hope. The revelation seemed to shake something fundamental in Pain's understanding of power. All of his techniques, all of his philosophy, was based on the idea that strength meant the ability to cause destruction. But here was someone whose strength lay in the ability to prevent it. "I don't understand," the Devapath admitted, its voice carrying genuine confusion. "If you have this power, why didn't you use it to prevent the attack? Why let your village suffer if you could have stopped it?" The question cut to the heart of something Naruto had been struggling with since his return to Konoha. He did have the power to prevent attacks like this, his enhanced abilities, his strategic knowledge, his understanding of how organizations like the Akatsuki operated. So why hadn't he acted sooner? "Because," he said slowly, the answer forming as he spoke, "preventing all suffering isn't the same as eliminating the possibility of growth. People need to be able to make their own choices, even if those choices lead to pain. My job isn't to control every outcome, it's to make sure that when people fall, there's someone there to help them back up." The philosophy was radically different from anything Pain had encountered. Not rule through prevention of consequences, but rule through support during consequences. Not elimination of choice, but protection of the right to choose. "And what about justice?" the Devapath asked. "What about punishment for those who cause suffering?" "Justice and punishment aren't the same thing," Naruto replied with quiet certainty. "Justice is about restoring balance, about healing damage and preventing future harm. Punishment is about inflicting suffering in response to suffering, and that just creates more suffering." To demonstrate, he reached out toward the real Pain, not the 6 puppet bodies, but the broken young man who controlled them from a hidden location. His enhanced senses could track the chakra network that connected all the bodies, could follow it back to its source. But instead of using that knowledge to launch an attack, instead of striking at Pain's true form with overwhelming force, he simply spoke. "Nagato," he said, and his voice carried across dimensions, reaching the crippled young man who had convinced himself that becoming a god was the only way to honor his friends' deaths. "I know you can hear me, I know you're listening, and I want you to know that I understand." The effect was immediate. All 6 Pain bodies froze in place as their controller found himself facing something he had never expected, genuine empathy from someone who possessed the power to destroy him utterly. "You've lost people you cared about," Naruto continued, his voice carrying gentle understanding. "You've watched injustice triumph over righteousness, seen good people die for causes that didn't deserve their sacrifice. And it hurt so much that you convinced yourself the only way to honor their memory was to make sure no one else ever had to experience that kind of loss." Through the chakra network that connected him to his bodies, Nagato could feel something extraordinary, not the cold authority of absolute power, but the warm authority of genuine care. This wasn't someone who wanted to dominate him, but someone who wanted to help him heal. "But causing more pain doesn't honor the pain you've experienced," Naruto said with quiet conviction. "It just spreads it around, makes more people carry the same burden you've been carrying. That's not justice, that's just making everyone else as broken as you are." "Then what?" Nagato's voice came through the Devapath, carrying more vulnerability than it had shown since the battle began. "What's the alternative? How do you honor the dead without ensuring their sacrifice meant something?" "By living," Naruto replied simply. "By choosing to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to build something beautiful enough to justify their loss. By becoming someone they would have been proud to know." The words carried spiritual pressure that made reality itself seem to hold its breath. Around them, the restoration effect continued to spread, not just physical healing, but something deeper, something that touched the very foundations of what it meant to exist in community with others. "I've been where you are," Naruto continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I've lost people I cared about to forces beyond my control, watched my kingdom burn while I was powerless to stop it. And for a long time, I thought the only appropriate response was to become strong enough that nothing could ever threaten me again. And," Nagato asked through his puppet, "and I learned that strength without purpose is just another form of weakness. That power exercised in isolation creates only emptiness. That the strongest kings are those who serve their people, not those who demand to be served." He gestured toward the slowly healing village around them. "This is what real power looks like, not the ability to destroy whatever threatens you, but the ability to protect whatever you love. Not dominance over others, but the wisdom to help them become their best selves." For a long moment, the battlefield was silent except for the sound of stone reforming and metal healing. Nagato, speaking through his Devapath, finally broke the silence. "And if I choose differently," he asked, If I continue on my current path, then you'll learn the same lesson I did, Naruto replied with quiet certainty. That kingdoms built on fear crumble from within, that gods who rule through pain discover their subjects secretly hope for their downfall, and that power exercised without wisdom ultimately consumes the one who wields it. The prediction carried the weight of prophecy, of personal experience with the exact consequences he was describing. But there was no threat in his voice, no suggestion that he would be the agent of Nagato's downfall. Just sad certainty that the path the other man was on led nowhere worth going. I offer you a different choice, Naruto continued, his voice carrying gentle invitation. Help me rebuild what you've destroyed. Use your power to heal rather than harm, to create rather than destroy. Become someone your friends would have been proud to know. And if I refuse, then you refuse, Naruto replied simply. I won't force you to choose redemption, that has to come from within. But I will protect the people you're threatening, and I will continue to offer you the chance to choose differently for as long as you're willing to listen. The offer hung in the air like a challenge to everything Nagato had convinced himself was true about power and justice and the nature of human relationships. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely uncertain about what choice to make. It was the sight of Konoha slowly healing around them that finally decided him. The buildings reforming, the streets repairing themselves, the sense of hope returning to a place that had been devastated by his techniques. All of it spoke to possibilities he had convinced himself were impossible. How? He asked finally, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than skeptical challenge. Together, Naruto replied with quiet certainty. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of compassion at a time. It's not fast and it's not easy, but it's the only way that creates lasting change. The battle was over, though it had ended not with victory and defeat, but with understanding and choice. As the sun set over a village that was already beginning to show signs of recovery, Naruto stood in his God King mode and felt something he had never experienced as Baraggan Luisenbern, genuine satisfaction with power used wisely. The integration was complete now. The boy who wanted acknowledgement and the God King who commanded worship had become something greater than either alone, a ruler who served, a king who protected, a leader who inspired rather than intimidated. There would be other challenges ahead, other battles to fight, other choices to make. But for the first time since his memories began awakening, Naruto felt confident that he was becoming exactly who he was meant to be. Not Baraggan Luisenbern reborn, but Naruto Uzumaki enhanced by the wisdom of ages. Not a God King demanding worship, but a protector offering hope. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. The declaration of the Fourth Great Ninja War came exactly 18 months after Pain's conversion, delivered by a figure whose very existence challenged everything the ninja world thought it understood about the boundaries between life and death. Kabuto Yakushi, now calling himself the Dragon Sage, had perfected the Edo Tensei technique to degrees that bordered on the obscene, and his ultimatum was as simple as it was terrifying. Surrender the remaining Jinchuriki, or face an army of every legendary ninja who had ever lived. Naruto stood in the Allied Forces Command Center, studying intelligence reports that read like a catalog of impossibilities. The second and third Raikage, fighting alongside the Gold and Silver Brothers. The previous generation of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, their blades gleaming with techniques that had carved their way through history. Most troubling of all, Madara Uchiha himself returned from death with power that existed beyond normal categories of measurement. This changes everything, Tsunade said, her voice tight with concern as she reviewed the same reports. Fighting living opponents is one thing, but the undead, they feel no pain, require no rest, and possess all the knowledge and abilities they had in life. Plus whatever enhancements Kabuto has added, Shikamaru added grimly. Intelligence suggests he's modified the technique to make them stronger than they were originally. Naruto listened to the strategic discussion with only half his attention. The other half was focused on memories that were becoming more vivid than ever before, recollections of battles fought against enemies who had transcended death, of techniques designed specifically to combat beings that existed beyond normal life and death. Actually, he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made the other commanders turn to look at him, this might be the first advantage we've had since the war began. How do you figure that? Gaara asked, his pale eyes studying Naruto with calculating intensity. Because I remember fighting armies of the undead, Naruto replied, and his voice carried the weight of personal experience. In my previous existence, death wasn't the end of conflict, it was just another state of being that could be weaponized. I've commanded undead soldiers, fought against undead opponents, and learned the weaknesses that all such beings share. The admission hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled commanders thought they understood about their ally. Several of them exchanged glances that mixed concern with curiosity. Previous existence, Tsunade asked carefully. The memories I've been recovering, Naruto explained, his appearance beginning to shift slightly as he accessed deeper levels of integration between his two natures. They're not just dreams or visions, they're actual recollections of a life lived as something beyond human limitations. And that existence included extensive experience with entities that had transcended mortality. To demonstrate, he gestured toward one of the intelligence reports, a detailed analysis of the third Raikage's defensive capabilities. As his enhanced perception focused on the document, text began to appear in the margins, written in his own handwriting but containing tactical knowledge that belonged to someone else. Physical attacks enhanced by lightning chakra, he read aloud, though the words were appearing as he spoke them. Weakness, spiritual techniques that target the animating force rather than the physical form, recommended counter. Disruption of the binding between soul and vessel through selective entropy application. The commanders stared as more information continued to appear, detailed tactical analyses of dozens of legendary ninja, complete with specific countermeasures and strategic recommendations. How is this possible? One of the Jonin asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Because I've fought them before, Naruto replied with quiet certainty. Not these specific individuals, but beings like them. The undead may seem unstoppable, but they're actually more vulnerable than living opponents in several key ways. He moved to the command center's main tactical display, where a map of the battlefield showed the positions of both allied and enemy forces. As he touched the surface, new symbols began to appear, deployment patterns and strategic positions that incorporated knowledge from wars fought across dimensions. First, he continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded armies, undead soldiers are bound to their animator through spiritual connections. Disrupt those connections, and the soldiers become inert. Second, beings that have transcended death are often more vulnerable to techniques that target their spiritual rather than physical form. And third, he paused, his expression growing thoughtful as deeper memories surfaced. Third, most undead entities retain the psychological patterns they had in life. They can be manipulated through the same emotional triggers that affected them originally, but they also carry the same blind spots and limitations. You're talking about this like you've personally commanded undead armies, Gaara observed, his voice carefully neutral. I have, Naruto replied simply. In my memories as Baraggan Luxenbern, I ruled over a kingdom populated entirely by beings that had transcended mortality. Hollows, they were called souls that had lost their humanity and become something else. I commanded millions of them across campaigns that spanned centuries. The revelation should have been met with disbelief or horror. Instead, the assembled commanders found themselves leaning forward with intense interest. If their strongest ally truly had experience with this kind of warfare, it might be the edge they desperately needed. Show us, Tsunade said after a moment of tense silence. Naruto nodded, closing his eyes and reaching for the deeper levels of integration he had achieved through years of training. When he opened them again, they held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond mortal comprehension. Senescentia command mode, he said, and his voice carried harmonics that belonged to someone who had ruled over concepts themselves. The transformation was subtle but profound. His usual sage mode markers appeared, but they were enhanced by something else, a spiritual pressure that spoke not just of personal power, but of administrative authority over vast systems of existence. Around him, the command center's equipment began to respond to his presence, displays updating with information that shouldn't have been accessible through normal channels. First lesson, he said, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone teaching essential skills. Undead beings are animated by spiritual energy that follows predictable patterns. Watch, he gestured toward the tactical display, where symbols representing Edo Tensei soldiers began to move in new configurations. But these weren't random movements. They were precise tactical deployments that incorporated knowledge of how undead forces could be most effectively countered. Every reanimated ninja retains muscle memory from their living combat experience, he continued, his analysis incorporating centuries of observation and command. But that same muscle memory creates predictable response patterns. The The third Raikage, for example, will always favor direct assault tactics because that's how he achieved his greatest victories in life. The tactical implications were staggering. If they could predict how the legendary reanimated ninja would behave, they could prepare specific countermeasures for each one. Second lesson, Naruto continued, his command of the situation becoming more apparent as he settled fully into his role as strategic commander. The binding between an Edo Tensei soul and its artificial body is maintained through specific spiritual frequencies. Disrupt those frequencies, and the reanimation fails. To demonstrate, he reached out with his enhanced senses toward one of the distant battlefields. His perception, expanded by memories of commanding across dimensional boundaries, could actually sense the spiritual networks that connected Kabuto to his undead army. "I can feel them," he said with quiet amazement. The connections, the control mechanisms, the way the technique maintains coherence across such vast distances. It's elegant, actually, horrific, but elegant. "Can you disrupt it?" Shikamaru asked, his tactical mind already racing through the implications. "Not from here," Naruto replied after a moment of analysis. "The technique is too well established, and Kabuto is maintaining it from a hidden location, but on the battlefield against individual reanimations. Yes, I can sever those connections permanently." The promise of being able to neutralize Edo Tensei soldiers permanently rather than just temporarily sent ripples of excitement through the command center. But it was Naruto's next revelation that truly changed the strategic landscape. "Third lesson," he said, his voice carrying grim certainty. "The person controlling this technique, Kabuto, you said, he's not acting alone. I can sense another spiritual pressure behind his, something that feels familiar." His expression grew troubled as deeper memories surfaced, bringing with them recollections of power that existed beyond normal categories of measurement. "Whoever is really orchestrating this war, they carry the same spiritual signature as someone I encountered in another life. Someone who believed himself capable of reshaping reality according to his vision of perfection." "Are you saying this Kabuto is being controlled by someone else?" Tsunade asked. "I'm saying the power structure behind this war is more complex than we realized," Naruto replied with growing certainty. "And the ultimate enemy is someone who has transcended normal limitations, someone like Aizen Sasuke, but adapted to this world's power systems." The name meant nothing to the assembled commanders, but the certainty in Naruto's voice was unmistakable. He wasn't speculating or theorizing, he was remembering. "We need to get to the battlefield," he said finally, his tactical analysis complete. "The sooner I can start disrupting their undead forces, the better our chances become." The deployment took place within hours, with Naruto assigned to the battlefield where the most dangerous Edo Tensei were concentrated. As he approached the combat zone, he could feel the spiritual pressures of legendary ninja clashing in combinations that had never occurred in life. But it was the sight of Madara Uchiha that truly triggered his complete awakening. The legendary Uchiha stood in the center of a crater that had once been a mountain, his presence dominating everything around him. His eternal Mangekyou Sharingan spun lazily as he surveyed the battlefield, and his spiritual pressure carried the same casual arrogance that Naruto remembered from another enemy in another time. "So," Madara said without turning around, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity, "the Nine-Tails Jinchuriki finally arrives. I was beginning to think you were too afraid to face a true Uchiha." The taunt should have triggered Naruto's usual explosive response. Instead, it activated memories that were crystallizing with perfect clarity, recollections of another being who had carried himself with identical arrogance, who had spoken with the same certainty in his own superiority. "Aizen," Naruto whispered, and his voice carried recognition that went beyond the physical. "You're just like him. Same arrogance, same certainty, same belief that power gives you the right to reshape the world." Madara finally turned, his Sharingan focusing on Naruto with laser intensity. "Aizen, I'm unfamiliar with that name, but if they possess true power, then perhaps we have something in common." "You do," Naruto replied, his appearance beginning to shift as he accessed levels of integration that he had never reached before. "You both believe that individual strength is more important than collective bonds, that power justifies any action, that the strong have the right to determine the fate of the weak." As he spoke, his transformation continued beyond anything he had previously achieved. The God King mode he had accessed during the Pain Invasion was impressive, but this was something entirely different, a fusion of every aspect of his nature into something that transcended both human and hollow categories. His Sage mode markers appeared, but they were enhanced by spiritual pressure that belonged to someone who had ruled over dimensions. The crown above his brow became solid and visible, constructed from crystallized time itself. Most dramatically, his presence began to affect reality on a fundamental level, not just aging individual objects, but manipulating the flow of time across the entire battlefield. "Eternal Hokage mode," he said, and his voice carried such authority that the very air seemed to crystallize around the words. The perfect fusion of mortal ideals and immortal power, of human compassion and divine authority. The spiritual pressure that rolled off him was unlike anything the ninja world had ever recorded. It carried the protective instincts of someone who had sworn to defend his village, the tactical knowledge of someone who had commanded armies across dimensions, and the wisdom of someone who had learned from the mistakes of absolute power. "Impossible," Madara breathed, his Sharingan spinning frantically as it tried to process what it was seeing. "No human can manifest spiritual pressure of that magnitude." "I'm not just human anymore," Naruto replied calmly. "I'm something new, a fusion of everything I've learned and everything I've been. And what I've learned is that true strength comes not from the power to dominate, but from the wisdom to serve." To demonstrate, he gestured toward the battlefield around them. But instead of launching an attack, instead of trying to overwhelm his opponent with raw force, he simply spoke. "You think reshaping the world according to your vision will bring peace," he said, his voice carrying gentle understanding. Aizen thought the same thing. He convinced himself that imposing his will on reality was an act of mercy, that forcing everyone to live according to his ideals would eliminate conflict. "And?" Madara asked, though his confident posture had shifted to something more defensive. "And he learned the same lesson you're about to learn," Naruto replied with sad certainty. "That peace imposed through force isn't peace at all, it's just oppression with better marketing. That strength used to eliminate choice doesn't create harmony, it creates resentment that eventually explodes into revolution." The words carried spiritual pressure that made reality itself seem to hold its breath. Around them, the battle between allied and reanimated forces continued, but both Naruto and Madara seemed to exist in a bubble of suspended time. "You speak of choice as if it has value," Madara said, his voice carrying genuine confusion. "But look around you, see what choice has created. War, hatred, suffering that spans generations. Surely eliminating the possibility of making wrong choices is preferable to allowing this cycle to continue." "Is it?" Naruto asked seriously. "What's the point of existence without the ability to choose? What meaning does peace have if it's not freely chosen? What value does happiness possess if it's not earned through struggle?" The questions cut to the heart of philosophical differences that went beyond mere tactical disagreement. Madara's entire worldview was based on the idea that sufficiently advanced power could create perfect conditions for human happiness. But Naruto, carrying memories of both human struggle and divine authority, understood something deeper. "I've ruled over beings who had no choice but to obey me," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "I commanded absolute loyalty, perfect order, complete submission to my will. And do you know what I discovered?" "What?" Madara asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "That kingdoms built on compelled obedience are hollow at their core," Naruto replied with quiet conviction. "That subjects who cannot choose to follow you will never truly support you. That power exercised without consent creates only the illusion of order, while genuine chaos builds in the shadows." To illustrate his point, he gestured toward the reanimated ninjas scattered across the battlefield. "Look at your undead army. Perfect soldiers incapable of disobedience, free from doubt or fear or hesitation. They should be the ideal military force, and yet they're weaker than living opponents of equivalent skill. Do you know why?" Madara's expression shifted from confidence to genuine interest. "Explain." "Because they cannot grow," Naruto replied simply. "They cannot learn from mistakes, cannot adapt to unexpected situations, cannot develop new techniques or strategies. They're locked into the patterns they had in life, incapable of evolution or improvement." As if summoned by his words, one of the Edo Tensei soldiers, the second Mizukage, launched an attack that should have been devastating. His oil and water techniques created battlefield conditions that would have challenged even elite Jounin. But Naruto moved through them with fluid grace, his enhanced perception allowing him to see not just what the reanimated cage was doing, but what he was incapable of doing. Every technique, every tactic, every strategic decision was locked into patterns established decades ago. There was no creativity, no adaptation, no growth. Predictable, Naruto said as he effortlessly countered techniques that had once been considered unstoppable. Every move telegraphed by muscle memory, every strategy limited by experiences that can never be updated. This is what happens when you eliminate the possibility of change. He reached out toward the second Mizukage, but instead of attacking, he simply touched the spiritual connections that bound the cage's soul to his artificial body. The aging effect he applied was surgical in its precision, not enough to destroy the reanimation, but enough to disrupt the control mechanisms that prevented independent thought. The result was immediate and profound. The second Mizukage's eyes cleared, losing the vacant quality that marked all Edo Tensei soldiers, and for the first time since his resurrection, he was truly alive again. Where am I? The Mizukage asked, his voice carrying confusion and growing horror as he realized his situation. You're being used as a weapon against people you have no quarrel with, Naruto replied gently. But I can free you from that control if you're willing to choose freedom over compulsion. Choose, the Mizukage repeated, the word seeming foreign after so long without the ability to make independent decisions. Choose, Naruto confirmed. Fight alongside us or return to your rest or even continue serving your summoner if that's truly what you want. The decision is yours. The offer of genuine choice, the first the Mizukage had experienced since his resurrection, seemed to transform him completely. His posture straightened, his eyes gained focus and purpose, and his spiritual pressure shifted from the hollow emptiness of compelled service to something approaching genuine life. I choose freedom, he said with quiet certainty, and I choose to help you stop whoever is responsible for this abomination. The transformation was visible proof of Naruto's philosophy in action. A being that had been nothing more than an animated puppet became a genuine ally the moment he was offered the right to choose his own path. Madara watched this demonstration with growing unease. Interesting technique, he said carefully, but individual conversions won't stop an army. Won't they? Naruto asked with quiet confidence. He gestured toward the broader battlefield, and Madara could see that similar transformations were occurring wherever Naruto's influence reached. Edo Tensei soldiers were regaining their independence, making their own choices about whether to continue fighting, and in most cases choosing to either switch sides or simply return to their eternal rest. This is what happens when you offer people genuine choice, Naruto explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned these lessons through painful experience. Most of them choose connection over isolation, cooperation over domination, service to others over service to themselves. And if they choose wrongly, Madara asked, if they use their freedom to create more suffering, then they learn from the consequences, Naruto replied with quiet certainty. Growth comes from making mistakes and learning to do better. Wisdom comes from experiencing failure and choosing to try again. Strength comes from facing challenges and discovering you're capable of more than you thought. The philosophy was radically different from anything Madara had encountered. Not elimination of the possibility of failure, but support during failure. Not prevention of poor choices, but guidance toward better ones. You speak of ideals, Madara said, his voice carrying skeptical challenge. But ideals are fragile things, easily broken by harsh realities. Power, on the other hand, is eternal. Is it? Naruto asked seriously. Then why did Aizen fall? Why did I fall in my previous existence? Why does every empire eventually crumble, no matter how powerful its founder? The question struck at the heart of Madara's certainty. In his memories, the Uchiha had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had witnessed the collapse of systems that seemed unshakable. But he had convinced himself that sufficient power could overcome those historical patterns. Because, Naruto continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience, power exercised without wisdom creates the conditions for its own destruction. Rulers who govern through fear generate subjects who secretly hope for their downfall. Systems based on compulsion create resistance that builds until it becomes unstoppable. To demonstrate, he gestured toward Kabuto's hidden location, not attacking it, but simply observing it with senses enhanced by memories of dimensional command. Your ally, the one controlling the Edo Tensei technique, he said with growing certainty. He's already planning your betrayal. I can sense it in the spiritual networks he's maintaining, backup plans, contingency measures, techniques designed to eliminate you once you've served your purpose. Madara's expression shifted from confidence to wariness. Impossible. Kabuto serves the same goals I do. Does he? Naruto asked gently. Or Or does he serve his own goals while allowing you to believe they align with yours? I've seen this pattern before, subordinates who smile and nod while secretly preparing to take everything you've built. The prediction carried the weight of prophecy, of personal experience with the exact betrayals he was describing. Madara found himself reconsidering relationships he had taken for granted, examining alliances he had assumed were secure. Even if you're correct, he said finally, it changes nothing. The world still needs to be remade, chaos still needs to be eliminated, suffering still needs to be ended. I agree, Naruto said, and his immediate agreement seemed to surprise them both. The world does need to be changed. But not through force, through example. Not by eliminating choice, by demonstrating that good choices lead to good outcomes. Not by imposing order, by inspiring people to create order themselves. The alternative he was describing was more difficult, more uncertain, and infinitely more risky than Madara's approach. But it was also more sustainable, more genuine, and more respectful of individual dignity. And if people choose chaos anyway, Madara asked, if they reject your example and embrace conflict, then I'll be there to help them deal with the consequences, Naruto replied with quiet certainty. Not to punish them for choosing wrongly, but to support them while they learn to choose better. The promise carried spiritual pressure that spoke of absolute commitment, not to controlling outcomes, but to remaining available as a source of help and guidance regardless of how many times people made mistakes. Before Madara could respond, the battlefield around them suddenly shifted. New spiritual pressures were appearing, not the hollow emptiness of Edo Tensei soldiers, but something else entirely. Something that felt like the intersection between human ambition and powers that existed beyond normal reality. He's coming, Naruto said with quiet certainty, his enhanced senses detecting changes that others couldn't perceive. The one who's really behind this war. Not Kabuto, he's just a puppet. Someone else, someone who has transcended normal limitations and convinced himself that reshaping reality is his right and responsibility. The spiritual pressure that was building felt familiar, carrying echoes of something Naruto had encountered in another life, another dimension. But it was adapted to this world's power systems, filtered through this reality's understanding of chakra and jutsu. Impossible, Madara breathed, his Sharingan spinning as it tried to process readings that shouldn't exist. That level of power, it's beyond what any human should be capable of achieving. Yes, Naruto agreed grimly, it is. Which means we're about to face someone who has stopped being human entirely. Someone like I was in my previous existence, but without the wisdom that comes from having experienced the consequences of absolute power. The revelation hung between them like a challenge to everything they thought they understood about the nature of this conflict. This wasn't just a war between different philosophies of governance. It was a confrontation between different understandings of what it meant to transcend human limitations. As the new presence continued to build, reality itself began to warp around its manifestation. This wasn't someone who used techniques to manipulate the world. This was someone who commanded fundamental forces directly, whose will had become powerful enough to reshape existence itself. Kaguya, Naruto whispered as deeper memories surfaced, bringing with them recollections of entities that had ruled over concepts rather than territories. The rabbit goddess, the mother of chakra, the one who first brought these powers to this world. The name carried weight that went beyond historical significance. This wasn't just another powerful opponent. This was the original source of the power systems that defined their reality, returned to reclaim what she saw as rightfully hers. Now I understand, Naruto said with quiet certainty, his eternal Hokage mode stabilizing into its perfect form. This whole war, all the manipulation and betrayal and orchestrated conflict, it was never about peace or order or eliminating suffering. It was about gathering enough power to break the seals that held her, about creating the conditions necessary for her return. The revelation recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the conflict. Madara hadn't been the ultimate enemy, he had been another pawn, manipulated by forces that existed beyond his understanding. Then we have a choice, Naruto continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to balance idealism with pragmatism. We can continue fighting each other, while a being who sees all of humanity as her property prepares to eliminate our freedom entirely, or we can work together to preserve the right of people to make their own choices. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between their conflicting philosophies. Madara could continue pursuing his vision of imposed order, knowing now that it would ultimately serve someone else's agenda. Or he could accept that protecting the right to choose was more important than controlling the choices people made. What are you proposing? Madara asked, his voice carrying genuine uncertainty for the first time in decades. Partnership, Naruto replied simply. Not agreement. I still think your methods are wrong, and you probably still think mine are naive. But cooperation in service of something we both value, the right of people to determine their own fate. The alliance he was suggesting was pragmatic rather than philosophical, based on shared opposition to a greater threat rather than shared values. But it represented something unprecedented, the possibility that enemies could work together without surrendering their individual beliefs. As Kaguya's presence continued to build toward full manifestation, as reality itself began to bend around power that existed beyond normal categories of measurement, Naruto extended his hand toward his former enemy. "What do you say, Madara?" he asked, his voice carrying quiet confidence. Ready to show a goddess what mortals can accomplish when they choose to work together, the question would define not just the immediate battle, but the entire future of their world. Would they face the ultimate threat as divided enemies, or as allies united by their determination to protect the right of choice itself? The answer would determine whether humanity retained its freedom, or became nothing more than subjects in a kingdom ruled by a being who had never learned the difference between serving others and being served by them. The final battle for the soul of their world was about to begin. Kaguya Otsutsuki manifested above the battlefield like a nightmare given divine form. Her pale skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her Byakugan held depths that spoke of power accumulated across millennia, and her presence warped reality itself in ways that made even experienced ninja question the nature of existence. But it was her spiritual pressure that truly marked her as something beyond normal categories of threat. This wasn't just overwhelming power. This was the fundamental authority of someone who had created the very energy systems that defined their world, who saw all of chakra as an extension of her own will. "My chakra," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the words feel like physical weight, stolen by ungrateful children who have forgotten their place. "But I have returned to reclaim what was always mine." Naruto stood beside Madara in an alliance that would have been impossible hours earlier, both of them recognizing that their philosophical differences meant nothing in the face of a threat that would eliminate philosophy itself. But as he studied Kaguya with senses enhanced by memories of dimensional warfare, he began to understand something that changed everything. "She's not lying," he said quietly, his voice carrying grim realization. "Chakra really is hers originally. Every technique we've ever learned, every jutsu we've mastered, every power we've developed, all of it derived from energy that belongs to her." "Irrelevant," Madara replied, though his confidence sounded forced. "Ownership based on origin doesn't grant unlimited authority over current usage." "Doesn't it?" Kaguya asked, and her amusement carried undertones that belonged to something that had never acknowledged limits on its authority. "Watch and learn, little Uchiha." She gestured dismissively, and suddenly every ninja on the battlefield found their chakra responding to her will rather than their own. Jutsu failed mid-execution, enhanced strength disappeared without warning, and even the most basic techniques became impossible to perform. It should have been the end of organized resistance. An enemy who could simply turn off their primary power source was beyond any conceivable counter. But Naruto, carrying memories of beings who had commanded fundamental forces rather than borrowed them, understood something that others couldn't grasp. "She's not controlling our chakra," he said with growing certainty, his eternal Hokage mode remaining stable despite the disruption affecting everyone around him. "She's reclaiming it, pulling it back into herself." Which means his analysis was interrupted as Kaguya's attention fixed on him with laser intensity. Her Byakugan could perceive the spiritual energies that composed his enhanced form, and what she saw clearly disturbed her in ways that simple power never could. "Impossible," she breathed, her voice carrying genuine shock for the first time since her manifestation. "You carry energies that do not belong to this dimension, powers that were never derived from my chakra." "What are you?" "I'm something new," Naruto replied calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to integrate conflicting natures into something greater than either alone. A fusion of this world's power systems with knowledge and abilities that originated elsewhere. To demonstrate, he reached out with his aging abilities, not toward Kaguya herself, but toward the dimensional space that contained the battlefield. The technique he employed was unlike anything he had ever attempted before, drawing on memories of beings who had manipulated time and space on cosmic scales. "Selective temporal displacement," he explained conversationally as reality began to shift around them. Not aging in the conventional sense, but manipulation of the rate at which time flows through localized areas. The effect was immediately apparent. While Kaguya remained locked in normal temporal flow, the space around her began to accelerate. Seconds became minutes, minutes became hours, and the accumulated experience of extended time began to accumulate around her position. "Clever," she admitted, though her voice carried more annoyance than concern. "But you underestimate the scope of my authority." She gestured toward the altered temporal field, and reality simply corrected itself. Not through any visible technique, not through conscious manipulation, but through the fundamental assertion that her will took precedence over physical law. "This is my dimension," she continued, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Here, my authority supersedes your techniques, no matter how exotic their origin." The demonstration should have been discouraging, but Naruto found himself smiling instead. Because Kaguya, despite her overwhelming power, had just revealed something crucial about her nature. Something that echoed memories of another being who had believed himself beyond the reach of consequence. "You know," he said conversationally, his voice carrying gentle amusement, "you remind me of someone I knew in another life." Aizen Sasuke, brilliant, powerful, absolutely convinced that sufficient strength could reshape reality according to his vision. He had the same casual dismissal of opposition, the same certainty that his superior power justified any action. "And?" Kaguya asked, though her tone suggested growing annoyance. "And he learned the same lesson you're about to learn," Naruto replied with quiet confidence. "That power exercised without wisdom creates the conditions for its own destruction. That authority based solely on strength generates resistance that eventually becomes unstoppable." As he spoke, something extraordinary began to happen across the battlefield. The ninja who had been rendered powerless by Kaguya's chakra reclamation were discovering that they possessed resources she couldn't touch, not supernatural abilities, but human qualities that existed independent of any energy system. Determination, courage, the willingness to stand together against impossible odds, the refusal to surrender hope even in the face of overwhelming despair. "Interesting," Kaguya observed, though her voice carried more curiosity than concern. "They continue to resist despite being stripped of their primary capabilities, but human will, no matter how admirable, cannot overcome divine authority." "Can't it?" Naruto asked seriously. "Then how did I defeat Baraggan Luisenbern in my previous existence? How did mortal soul reapers bring down a god king who commanded time itself?" The question triggered memories that were crystallizing with perfect clarity, recollections not just of his own death as Baraggan, but of the broader conflict that had led to it. He could see it all now. The way Aizen's overconfidence had created opportunities for opposition, the manner in which absolute power had generated the very resistance that eventually brought it down. "They won the same way you're going to lose," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Through cooperation, through the willingness to sacrifice individual advantage for collective benefit, through the understanding that some things are more valuable than personal survival." To demonstrate, he began to share his power, not the chakra-based abilities that Kaguya could reclaim, but the spiritual energies that belonged to his nature as something beyond normal human categories. The aging techniques, the temporal manipulation, the authority that came from remembering what it meant to rule over concepts themselves. The effect was immediate and profound. Madara, Sasuke, Sakura, Kakashi, and dozens of other ninja found themselves enhanced by abilities that existed outside Kaguya's sphere of influence. Not permanently, not without cost, but long enough to level the playing field. "Impossible," Kaguya said, her voice carrying genuine disbelief. "Power cannot be shared without dilution, authority cannot be distributed without weakening the source." "You're wrong," Naruto replied with quiet certainty. "Power shared willingly becomes stronger, not weaker. Authority exercised in service of others grows rather than diminishes. That's the difference between ruling through fear and leading through inspiration." The battle that followed was unlike anything their reality had ever recorded. Not a single overwhelming confrontation, but a coordinated effort that incorporated the strengths and abilities of everyone present. Naruto's temporal manipulation creating openings that others could exploit, Sasuke's spacetime techniques enhanced by knowledge that belonged to a god king, Sakura's medical abilities guided by memories of healing on cosmic scales. But it was the tactical coordination that truly made the difference. Every participant fighting not as an individual seeking personal victory, but as part of a greater whole working toward collective triumph. It was a demonstration of everything Naruto had learned about the difference between commanding through authority and leading through example. Kaguya, despite her overwhelming individual power, found herself increasingly isolated. Her techniques, no matter how devastating, were countered by coordinated responses that incorporated knowledge from across dimensions. Her authority, no matter how absolute, was undermined by the willingness of mortals to choose cooperation over submission. "This is impossible," she repeated, her voice carrying growing frustration. "Individual mortals cannot overcome divine authority through mere coordination." "They're not just coordinating," Naruto replied, his voice carrying gentle understanding. "They're demonstrating something you've forgotten, that power shared willingly becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. That authority exercised in service of others creates bonds that transcend individual limitations." As if summoned by his words, the final phase of the battle began. Not a single devastating technique, but something far more profound, a fusion of wills and purposes that created something entirely new. "Ultimate integration," Naruto said, and his voice carried harmonics that made reality itself seem to hold its breath. "Not just the merger of my two natures, but the integration of everyone who has chosen to stand together." The transformation was visible to anyone with the sensitivity to perceive spiritual pressure. Naruto's eternal Hokage mode expanded beyond his individual form, incorporating the strengths and abilities of everyone who had chosen to trust him with their power. Not absorption or domination, but genuine partnership that enhanced everyone involved. The form that emerged was indescribable in conventional terms. It carried Naruto's determination and compassion, Baraggan's wisdom and authority, Sasuke's analytical precision, Sakura's healing knowledge, Kakashi's tactical expertise, and the accumulated will of hundreds of ninja who had chosen to fight for something greater than themselves. "This is what true power looks like," Naruto said, his voice now carrying harmonics that belonged to something that transcended individual existence while honoring every component that comprised it. Not the ability to dominate others, but the wisdom to inspire them to become their best selves. The spiritual pressure radiating from the integrated form was unlike anything any dimension had ever recorded. It carried the protective authority of someone who served rather than ruled, the wisdom of someone who had learned from the mistakes of absolute power, and the love of someone who valued bonds above personal advancement. Kaguya, facing opposition that existed beyond her ability to categorize or counter, finally understood what she was truly confronting. This wasn't just another powerful enemy. This was the manifestation of everything she had never been able to comprehend about the value of connection over control. "You would choose unity over dominion?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine confusion. "You would share power rather than hoarding it. You would serve others rather than demanding service." "Yes," Naruto replied simply, his voice now carrying the collective will of everyone who had chosen to stand with him. "Because that's what strength really means, not the ability to force others to submit, but the wisdom to help them choose to cooperate." The philosophical difference was more devastating than any technique could have been. Kaguya, whose entire existence was based on the assumption that power justified any action, found herself facing a demonstration that some things were more powerful than force. "I don't understand," she admitted, her voice carrying an uncertainty that had never existed in her consciousness before. "I know," Naruto replied with gentle compassion. "And that's why you have to be stopped, not because you're evil, but because you've never learned that there's a difference between ruling others and serving them." The final technique wasn't an attack in any conventional sense. Instead of trying to destroy Kaguya, instead of overwhelming her with superior force, Naruto simply offered her something she had never experienced before, genuine understanding of what it felt like to care about something more than personal power. The effect was immediate and profound. Kaguya, faced with emotions and concepts that existed beyond her experience, found her certainty beginning to crack. For the first time in millennia, she questioned whether absolute authority was really what she wanted. She began, then stopped, having no words for what she was experiencing. "You don't have to be alone," Naruto said gently. "You don't have to carry the weight of absolute responsibility. You can choose to be part of something larger rather than trying to control everything smaller." The offer hung in the air like an invitation to transformation. Kaguya could continue pursuing her vision of absolute control, knowing now that it would ultimately isolate her from everything that made existence meaningful. Or she could accept that sharing power created possibilities that hoarding it never could. The choice she made would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but the entire future of how power was understood and exercised in their world. As the integrated form waited patiently for her decision, as the assembled ninja held their collective breath, as reality itself seemed suspended between competing visions of what authority should mean, Kaguya finally spoke. "Teach me," she said quietly, her voice carrying a humility that had never existed in her consciousness before. "Show me what I've been missing." The request marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The age of absolute authority, of power exercised without accountability, of rule through fear and domination was ending. In its place, something new was beginning. An understanding that true strength came from service, that genuine authority grew from the willingness to be held accountable, that the most powerful rulers were those who worked to eliminate the need for rulers entirely. The war was over, but the real work was just beginning. 5 years later, the office of the 7th Hokage was unlike any that had come before it. Instead of a single desk where one person made decisions for an entire village, it contained a circular table where representatives from every aspect of Konoha's society gathered to discuss policy and direction. The Hokage still held ultimate authority, but that authority was exercised in consultation with those who would be affected by it. Naruto Uzumaki sat at that table, reviewing proposals for expanded medical training programs, trade agreements with former enemy villages, and research initiatives designed to share beneficial techniques across traditional boundaries. But it was the letter from Sasuke that commanded most of his attention. "The integration process is working better than we hoped," his former teammate had written. "Former Akatsuki members who chose rehabilitation over punishment are becoming some of our most effective ambassadors to other dimension-displaced individuals. Turns out people who have experienced the consequences of power without wisdom are uniquely qualified to help others avoid the same mistakes." The rehabilitation program had been one of Naruto's first initiatives as Hokage, based on his understanding that punishment without the opportunity for growth simply created more problems. Former enemies like Nagato, Chunin, and even Kabuto were now working to help others who struggled with the temptation of absolute power. "Hokage-sama," his assistant said quietly, interrupting his reading, "the delegation from the Hidden Stone is here for their appointment." Naruto nodded, setting aside the letter and preparing to engage with one of the many diplomatic initiatives that now occupied most of his time. The Stone Ninja were here to discuss the longevity techniques he had developed, jutsu that could extend healthy lifespan for those who dedicated themselves to peaceful service. It had been one of his most controversial innovations, granting additional decades of life to individuals who proved their commitment to building rather than destroying. Critics argued that it created unfair advantages, while supporters pointed to the remarkable results it had generated in formerly conflict-prone regions. "Send them in," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had learned to balance idealism with practical governance. The Stone delegation was led by their current Tsuchikage, a woman who had once been among his harshest critics but had gradually come to respect his methods. Behind her stood representatives from various aspects of their society, ninja, civilians, scholars, and artisans who had all contributed to their village's remarkable transformation. "Hokage Uzumaki," the Tsuchikage said with formal respect, "we come to request consideration for expanded access to the longevity techniques." "Of course," Naruto replied, gesturing for them to take seats around the circular table. "But you know the requirements. Demonstrate consistent commitment to peaceful resolution of conflicts, show measurable progress in reducing violence within your borders, and provide evidence of active efforts to heal rather than harm." "Which is exactly why we're here," the Tsuchikage replied with quiet pride. "Our violent crime rates have dropped by 70% over the past 3 years. We've successfully mediated border disputes with 3 neighboring territories without resorting to military action. And our new hospitals and schools are providing services to civilians from across the continent." The report was impressive, representing exactly the kind of transformation Naruto had hoped his policies would encourage. By linking extended lifespan to peaceful service, he had created incentives for behavior that benefited everyone involved. Additionally, one of the civilian representatives added, "We've documented significant improvements in quality of life indicators across all demographics. People are healthier, more educated, and more optimistic about the future than they've been in generations." "That's the real goal," Naruto said with satisfaction. "Not just preventing conflict, but creating conditions where people can flourish." The meeting continued for several hours, covering technical details of the longevity techniques, implementation strategies, and monitoring systems designed to ensure the power wasn't abused. It was the kind of complex, nuanced governance that would have been impossible without the wisdom he had gained from remembering what it meant to rule over vast systems. But it was also infused with compassion and humility that belonged entirely to Naruto Uzumaki, creating an approach to leadership that was unlike anything the ninja world had ever experienced. As the delegation prepared to leave, the Tsuchikage paused at the door. "Hokage-sama," she said quietly, "may I ask you something personal? Of course, the power you possess. We all know it goes far beyond normal human capabilities. You could impose your will on all of us if you chose to. What stops you?" The question cut to the heart of everything Naruto had learned about authority and responsibility. He was quiet for a moment, considering not just how to answer, but whether his answer would be understood. "Because," he said finally, "a true king serves his people by ensuring they never need a king." The philosophy he had developed represented the complete integration of everything he had been and everything he had chosen to become. The authority of someone who had ruled over dimensions, tempered by the compassion of someone who valued bonds above power. The wisdom of eons spent commanding concepts, balanced by the humility of a boy who had once just wanted to be acknowledged. "I don't understand," the Tsuchikage admitted. "The strongest leaders are those who work themselves out of a job," Naruto explained with gentle patience. "My goal isn't to be indispensable, it's to help everyone become capable of governing themselves. To create systems that function through voluntary cooperation rather than imposed authority. To build a world where people choose to do the right thing because they understand why it matters, not because they're forced to." The explanation carried weight that went beyond political theory. This was someone who had experienced the ultimate consequences of absolute power, who had learned through personal failure that authority exercised without accountability ultimately destroyed both ruler and ruled. After the delegation left, Naruto returned to his correspondence. But his attention was drawn to a particular letter that had arrived that morning, a message from Kaguya, who was now living quietly in a research facility where she was learning about concepts that had been foreign to her for millennia. "I begin to understand," she had written in her careful script, "what you meant about power shared willingly becoming stronger. The researchers here include me in their projects not because I command them to, but because they genuinely value my perspective. The feeling of being wanted rather than feared is indescribable. I am learning to ask questions instead of making proclamations, to listen instead of commanding, to contribute instead of controlling. It is difficult, my instincts still whisper that authority must be absolute to be effective, but the evidence suggests otherwise. You were right about something else as well. Ruling through fear created only the illusion of order while genuine chaos built in the shadows. But leadership exercised in service of others creates stability that exists independently of any single individual. Thank you for showing me a better way." The letter represented one of his greatest successes, not the defeat of an enemy, but the transformation of someone who had seemed irredeemably committed to destructive patterns. It was proof that even the most fundamental aspects of personality could change when exposed to better alternatives. As evening approached, Naruto made his way home through streets that hummed with peaceful activity. The village that had once shunned him now thrived under his leadership, but more importantly, it was developing the capacity to thrive without his leadership as well. Children played games that taught cooperation rather than dominance, their laughter carrying the sound of a generation that was learning different lessons about strength and authority. Adults engaged in community projects that benefited everyone involved, their commitment driven by understanding rather than compulsion. It was the world he had always dreamed of creating, not through force or manipulation, but through patient demonstration that better ways of living were possible. At his home, a modest building that reflected his philosophy that leaders should serve rather than be served, he found a surprise waiting for him. Sasuke had returned from his latest mission, and his former teammate was sitting on the porch with an expression that mixed satisfaction with ongoing determination. "How did it go?" Naruto asked, settling into a chair beside his friend. "Better than expected," Sasuke replied, pulling out a detailed report. "The Dimension Research Project has identified 3 more realities where individuals with memories similar to yours have appeared. They're struggling with the same integration challenges you faced, but they're willing to learn from your example." The Dimension Research Project was another of Naruto's innovations, based on his understanding that his own experience might not be unique. If other people in other realities were dealing with similar awakenings of ancient memories, they deserved access to the wisdom he had gained through trial and error. Any immediate crises? Naruto asked. One, Sasuke replied grimly. There's a young man in the third reality who's manifesting memories of someone called Iwatch the Almighty. He's convinced that his role is to eliminate the boundary between life and death, and he's gathering followers who share his vision of transcendence. The name triggered flashes of recognition in Naruto's enhanced memory. Not direct experience, but echoes of something Baraggan had been aware of, another being who had commanded vast power and convinced himself that reshaping reality was his responsibility. Another one who thinks absolute authority justifies any action, Naruto said with quiet understanding. What's the local situation? Deteriorating rapidly, Sasuke replied. His followers are growing in number and power, and the local authorities are completely outmatched. They've requested assistance from the Interdimensional Intervention Initiative. The initiative was yet another program Naruto had developed, designed to help other realities that were dealing with challenges similar to what their own world had faced. It was voluntary, carefully regulated, and focused on sharing knowledge rather than imposing solutions. Assemble a consultation team, Naruto decided after a moment of consideration. But remember the protocols: we advise and support, we don't control. The people of that reality have to make their own choices about how to handle their crisis. Even if their choices lead to catastrophe, Sasuke asked. Especially then, Naruto replied with quiet certainty. Freedom means nothing if it only applies to choices we approve of. Our job is to make sure they have access to information and alternatives, not to force them to use that access wisely. The philosophy represented the complete evolution of his understanding about authority and responsibility. Power exercised in service of others' right to choose, rather than in pursuit of outcomes he preferred. As they discussed the technical details of the intervention, as they planned strategies that prioritized local autonomy over external control, as they worked to help another reality avoid the mistakes their own world had made, Naruto felt the deep satisfaction that came from authority exercised wisely. He was exactly what he had always dreamed of becoming, not a king who demanded obedience, but a leader who inspired others to become their best selves. Not a ruler who imposed his will, but a protector who defended others' right to determine their own fate. The boy who had wanted acknowledgement and the god king who had commanded worship had become something greater than either alone. A servant of possibilities, a guardian of choice, a leader whose greatest success would be the day when his leadership was no longer needed. The story that had begun with dreams of forgotten kingdoms and ended with the wisdom to serve rather than rule was complete. But the work of building a better world, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one generation at a time, would continue for as long as people were willing to dream of something better than what they had inherited. And Naruto Uzumaki, the seventh Hokage, the god king who had chosen service over dominion, would be there to help them achieve those dreams for as long as they needed him. After all, he had learned the most important lesson any ruler could master: that the strongest kingdoms are built not on the power to command, but on the wisdom to inspire others to choose cooperation over conflict, connection over isolation, hope over despair. It was a lesson worth spending eternity. And there you have it, Naruto's incredible journey from a lonely kid with strange dreams to a god king who learned that true strength comes from serving others rather than ruling them. We watched him struggle with awakening memories of absolute power, nearly lose himself to Baraggan's arrogance, then ultimately forge something entirely new, a leader who uses cosmic authority to protect people's right to choose their own path. From accidentally aging his shadow clones to developing eternal Hokage mode and converting literal goddesses through compassion, this transformation was absolutely epic. What was your favorite moment? Was it when Naruto first manifested his crown during the Sasuke fight? The insane pain battle where he basically became a philosopher king? Or maybe that final Kaguya confrontation where he proved that shared power is stronger than hoarded authority? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing what resonates with you guys. And hey, if you enjoyed this story breakdown, make sure you're subscribed and let me know what other wild crossover concepts you want to see explored. Should we do Ichigo reincarnated as a Uchiha next? Or maybe Goku's memories awakening in Deku? The possibilities are endless. Alright guys, that's a wrap on this one. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace out.